She walked into that cathedral as a bride. She walked out as something they never saw coming. On the morning Sienna Hart was supposed to marry the man she loved, someone had already decided she needed to be destroyed. Not humiliated, not hurt, destroyed. What happened inside those walls in the next 4 hours would strip her of her name, her reputation, and every person she thought she could trust, and it would be broadcast to the world before the flowers had time to wilt. But they made one mistake. They left her standing. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved, drop your city in the comments below and hit that like button. Because this story is about to show you exactly what it looks like when a woman refuses to stay down. Watch until the end. Every part matters. The dress had taken 11 months to make. Sienna Hart knew that because she had been the one to commission it. Had sat in the atelier on Mercer Street with fabric swatches fanned across a glass table. Had argued with the designer about the weight of the silk. Had specifically requested that the back buttons be sewn with double thread because she was the kind of woman who thought about what happened when things came undone. She was an architect by training and by temperament. She understood load-bearing walls. She understood that the difference between a structure standing and a structure collapsing was almost always something small and invisible that nobody thought to check. She should have applied that understanding to her own life. At 7:43 in the morning, Sienna sat in a pale yellow room behind the main hall of Alderton Cathedral and stared at herself in a mirror framed with bare bulbs that buzzed faintly under the hum of the ventilation system. The dress was ivory, not white. She had been firm about that, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved when she moved, that didn't drag or pull but followed her, responsive, like something alive. Her dark hair was pinned back. Her jaw was set. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through. That was before the maid of honor knocked and came in without waiting for an answer. Priya Okafor had been Sienna's closest friend since their second year of architecture school, when they'd shared a studio table and survived a professor who believed sleep deprivation was a pedagogical tool. She was sharp-tongued and perceptive and almost never nervous. But she was nervous now. Sienna could see it in the way Priya was holding her bouquet, gripping the stems too tight, the knuckles going pale beneath her brown skin. "Grant's not in the groom's suite," Priya said. "It's early." "It's not that early, Sienna. His brother's there. His groomsmen are there. The tailor is there waiting to do a final press on his jacket." "Grant isn't." Sienna turned back to the mirror. In the reflection, she could see the door behind Priya, still half open, and beyond it the narrow corridor that led to the main entrance where guests were already gathering. She could hear the low accumulation of voices, the shuffle of heels on stone, the particular sound of a large space being filled by people who were dressed and seated and waiting for something to happen. "He's probably stepped out for air," she said. "He gets like that before big events." His phone is going to voicemail. "Priya, I'm telling you what I know." Sienna stood up from the vanity chair. The dress moved with her. She walked to the window, which looked out onto the side garden of the cathedral, a narrow rectangle of groomed boxwood and pale gravel, and empty. No Grant pacing. No Grant on a call with his hands jammed in his pockets the way he did when he was working through something. Just gravel and boxwood and a gardener's rake leaning against the far wall where someone had left it. "Have someone check the parking structure," she said. "Already did. His car is gone." The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Sienna felt something move through her that she couldn't name yet. Not panic, not grief, not even anger. Something older than all of those. Something that lived underneath them. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Priya repeated, and her voice cracked on the word just slightly. "Don't cry. You'll ruin your makeup, and I'll have to hear about it later." "I'm not crying, Sienna, what do you want to do?" What she wanted to do was find Grant Holloway and demand an explanation with the same precision and force she would bring to a structural deficiency report, controlled, thorough, devastating in its accuracy. What she did instead was pick up her own phone from the vanity and dial his number and listen to it ring 4 times, and then shift into the automated voice of his voicemail, which she had heard so many times over the past 2 years that she could have recited it. "You've reached Grant. Leave a message." She did not leave a message. She dialed his business partner instead. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring, and she could hear immediately that he was outside. Wind against the receiver, traffic somewhere behind him, the particular ambient noise of a city that was not a cathedral. "Sienna," he said, and the way he said it told her everything she needed to know about what he already knew. "Where is he, Marcus?" A pause. "I'm not—" "Don't. Just tell me where he is." Another pause, longer this time, and in it she could hear Marcus Webb making a decision. "He's not coming," Marcus said finally. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be the one telling you this." She ended the call. She stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, the screen still lit, and she thought about the dress, about the 11 months, about the double-threaded buttons. She thought about the 340 guests currently occupying pews in the main hall, most of them people she did not know well. Many of them people who owed their presence here to Grant's family and Grant's professional network and the particular social architecture of the Holloway name. She thought about Grant's mother, Claudette, who had made her opinions about Sienna known in the way wealthy women make their opinions known, never directly, always precisely, through small acts of exclusion and faint praise. And then, because she was who she stopped thinking about all of it and started thinking about what to do next. "I'm going out there," she said. Priya's head came up sharply. "Sienna?" Not to wait for him, to— The door opened. It wasn't Priya this time. It was Kelsey Marsh, the youngest bridesmaid, 23 years old, who worked as a junior associate at the design firm where Sienna had worked before going independent. Kelsey had large eyes and an open face, and she was the kind of person who, when she was frightened, looked exactly like she was frightened. No capacity for concealment, everything visible, everything right there on the surface. She was frightened now. She was frightened in a way that went well beyond the news that the groom was absent. "Something's happening," Kelsey said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know, Grant isn't—" "Not that." Kelsey shook her head. "Something else. In the main hall. People are on their phones. Something's going around." Sienna looked at her. "What's going around?" Kelsey's eyes cut sideways, not to Priya, not to the door, but down, to the floor, as if she couldn't hold the eye contact. "A video," she said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Sienna walked past Kelsey into the corridor, the dress moving around her, and she pushed through the small side entrance into the back of the main hall, and the first thing she registered was the sound. Not the usual gathering crowd sound she'd been hearing for the past hour. This was different. This was the particular noise that groups of people make when they are all looking at the same thing. A compressed, recursive murmur, a sound of shared discovery that has its own velocity, its own temperature. She had heard it before in her professional life, at site reviews when something had gone badly wrong and the assembled team was processing it together. She did not need to see the phones to understand what she was hearing, but she saw them anyway. Row after row, guests with their heads bowed over glowing screens, some of them already looking up at each other with the expression people wear when they have witnessed something they didn't expect to witness and aren't sure how to arrange their faces. Grant's mother in the third row, sitting perfectly straight, her expression unreadable, but her phone, Sienna noted, was already face down on the seat beside her, as if it had already served its purpose. She found a phone. A cousin she'd met twice at holiday gatherings who was sitting at the end of a pew near the aisle, staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open. He didn't notice her at first. She stepped close enough to see. The video was 47 seconds long. She didn't see all of it. She saw enough. A face that was her face, or assembled to look like her face, in a context that was designed to look incriminating. The voice was close enough to hers to pass. The room in the footage was generic, deliberately unplaceable. The man in the footage was not Grant. That was the thing that struck her first, the thing that caught, which meant the video's narrative was that she had been with someone else, that she had been betraying Grant, that the absent groom was not the offender here, that the woman standing in this hall in an 11-month dress was the reason this wedding was not happening. She handed the phone back without a word. Behind her, she heard Priya say something in a sharp, low voice to someone she couldn't see. She heard the accumulating whisper of the hall reaching a new pitch. She heard from somewhere near the front a woman's voice, older, controlled. saying something that ended with, "I tried to tell him." She didn't need to look to know whose voice it was. She was about to turn and walk back to the yellow room when she saw Kelsey. Kelsey Marsh had followed her into the hall and was standing at the far edge of the side entrance, still in the shadows just beyond where the candlelight reached, and she was doing something that nobody else in this building was doing. She was not looking at her phone. She was not looking at the guests. She was looking at Sienna with an expression that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She was trying to warn her. Not about the video. She'd already done that too late in the back room. This was something else. Her eyes were moving, I'd say, from Sienna's face to the side door on the far wall, the service entrance, the one that would not be watched. Her chin moved in that direction, almost imperceptibly, a small, desperate gesture. There was something else she knew, something she hadn't said yet. Sienna had been trained to read spaces, to understand what a structure was telling you through its materials, its geometries, its stress patterns. You did not ignore the wall that had a hairline crack running from the foundation to the ceiling. You did not dismiss it as cosmetic and move on. You stopped. You looked closer. She looked at Kelsey. Kelsey looked back, that terrified, wordless plea broadcasting across the 15 feet between them. And Sienna, instead of walking away from this building and the 340 people who now believed she was someone who had done the thing they'd seen on those screens, made a choice. She walked toward the service entrance. She waited. And 40 seconds later, Kelsey slipped through after her. The corridor beyond the service entrance was narrow and dim and smelled like stone and old wiring. A single bulb at ceiling height cast everything in a flat, unflattering yellow. The sounds from the main hall filtered through the wall in a muffled, pressurized way, like being underwater near the surface. Kelsey was shaking. Not performing fear, actually shaking, a fine tremor that started in her hands and moved through her shoulders. She was still carrying the bridesmaid's bouquet and the flowers were vibrating slightly with it. "Tell me," Sienna said. "I can't." Her voice cracked on the first word. "Sienna, if I tell you, but Kelsey, tell me right now." "I'm not supposed to know." The girl pressed her back against the wall, as if trying to put something solid behind her. "I found it by accident. I didn't go looking. It was just, I was in the server room at Holloway Group. We were doing the renovation specs, and one of the drawers was left open and there was a drive in it, and I shouldn't have looked, but the label on it had your name on it, and She stopped, swallowed. "There are files on it, a lot of files. The video isn't the beginning of this. It's the end of it. It's the last thing. They'd been planning it for months." "Who is they?" Kelsey pressed her eyes shut. "Grant," she said. "Marcus Webb. And a woman named Lena Ford." Sienna didn't recognize the last name. "Who is Lena Ford?" "She's a media consultant. She's the one who built the video. She's worked with Holloway Group before. Crisis management, narrative control, that's what she does. She helps people control stories before they can go public." Kelsey opened her eyes. "Sienna, there was a memo on that drive, dated 4 months ago. It was about you." The corridor felt colder than it had a moment ago. Or maybe it had always been this cold and she was only now registering it. "What did it say?" "It said you were a liability," Kelsey said. "It said you had access to financial documentation from the Alderton Bridge project that could, and I'm using their words, compromise ongoing regulatory negotiations. It said that your credibility needed to be neutralized before you—" She stopped again. "Before I what?" "Before you took it to the regulatory board." Kelsey's voice had dropped to something barely above breath. "Sienna, how much do you know about the Alderton Bridge project?" Everything went still. The Alderton Bridge project. Sienna had worked on it 18 months ago, back when she was still at Corman Associates. A mixed-use development bid tied to the city's infrastructure renewal package. The kind of project that moved through 4 layers of municipal approval and involved, she now recalled, a number of funding streams she had found difficult to trace back to their sources when she was preparing the project documentation. She had flagged 2 of those funding streams internally. She had been told by her senior partner at the time that they had been reviewed and cleared. She had moved on because she was a junior architect on the project, and because she was at the time newly engaged to Grant Holloway, and because she had trusted the people who told her things were fine. She understood now what the hairline crack in the wall had been trying to tell her. "How much money?" she said. Kelsey shook her head. "I don't know the exact number, but the memo referenced multiple accounts, and there was a name in one of the files that I recognized." She paused. Judge Harlan Voss. Sienna knew the name. Everyone in the development sector knew the name. Voss sat on the Municipal Infrastructure Committee that had approved the Alderton Bridge Project's funding package. He was 61 years old, had been on the committee for 9 years, and was known for being methodical and incorruptible. Known for it, publicly, loudly known for it. "You need to get out of this building," Kelsey said. "Not because you did anything wrong, because if they see you going through this, if they think you're working it out in real time, Marcus Webb has people here. Security, I mean. But not for the event. I saw them when I came in. 2 men I didn't recognize, not wearing anything formal, standing near the service exits." Sienna was quiet for a moment. The muffled noise from the main hall had taken on a new quality, a restless, unsettled energy, the sound of a crowd that had witnessed something unexpected and was beginning to make decisions about it. In another few minutes, someone would take some kind of formal action, a family member, a coordinator, the officiant, and the event would formally unravel and people would begin to leave. And the story they would carry out with them would be the story the video had written for them. She thought about the drive. She thought about the memo. She thought about the 4 months of deliberate, coordinated construction that had gone into making this morning look exactly the way it looked. They had used the wedding. They had used her own wedding, had let it proceed to this point, had let her order the dress and hire the caterer and send 340 invitations and stand in front of a mirror at 7:43 in the morning thinking about double-threaded buttons. And they had done it so that the moment of collapse would be maximally public, maximally damaging, maximally definitive. The cruelty of it was architectural. She recognized it because she understood how structures worked. "Where's the drive now?" she said. Kelsey hesitated. Then she reached into the small bag that was looped over her wrist, beneath the bouquet, and produced a USB drive no larger than her thumb. "I took it," she said. I know, but I took it before I came here this morning. I didn't know what else to do." Sienna looked at the drive. She looked at Kelsey's face, which was the face of someone who had been carrying this alone for however many hours it had taken her to get from wherever she found it to the stone corridor, and who was terrified and had done it anyway. "You did right," Sienna said. She took the drive. She pressed it into the small inside pocket of her dress, the one the designer had added at her request, because she was the kind of woman who thought about having her hands free. "Give me your coat," she said. Kelsey was wearing a thin wrap over her bridesmaid's dress, pale green, the kind of thing you brought to a formal event because cathedrals were always cold. She took it off and handed it to Sienna without asking why. Sienna pulled it on over the dress, which was the wrong color and wrong cut, and made the whole thing look incongruous and strange. And she was aware that she looked strange, and she did not care. "Don't go back into the main hall yet," Sienna told her. "Wait here for 10 minutes. Then go back. Say you felt sick. Say whatever you need to say. Don't mention me." "Where are you going?" "To find out what's actually on this drive." "Sienna, they have people—" "I know." She put her hand briefly on Kelsey's arm. "You warned me. That was already more than most people would have done." She turned to the corridor, which ran another 20 feet to a door that should, if the architectural plans she had reviewed as part of the event coordination were accurate, and she had reviewed them because she always reviewed plans, open onto the delivery alley on the east side of the building, away from the parking structure and the main entrance, and, she hoped, away from whatever 2 men Marcus Webb had positioned at the service exits. She pushed through the door. Cold air hit her immediately, the gray, damp cold of a late-morning city in November, and she stepped into the alley on heels that were wrong for this surface and wrapped Kelsey's green coat tighter around the ivory dress and did not look back. The alley was clear. 2 dumpsters, a chain-link panel that had been propped open for deliveries, a strip of wet pavement reflecting a sky the color of concrete. Somewhere behind her and above her, she could still hear the building, that specific frequency of 340 confused people occupying a space that had been designed for ceremony and had just become something else. She walked to the end of the alley and turned right and kept walking, and she did not stop. Her phone had 43 missed calls by the time she reached the end of the block. She didn't look at who they were from. She turned the phone face down in her hand and kept it there. And she counted her breath, in for 4, out for 4, the way she had been taught to do in the single month she'd tried meditation before deciding she didn't have the patience for it. It didn't work very well. Her hands were unsteady, and her jaw ached from how hard she was clenching it, and the heels were making small, bright points of pain with each step on the uneven pavement. She was not going to cry in this alley. She was not going to cry anywhere she could be seen or photographed. Whatever she was going to do with all of it, the rage, the grief, the specific and shattering humiliation of having been used as an instrument in her own destruction, she was going to do it later, in private, after she had understood what was actually on the drive. She hailed a cab at the intersection of Breck and 9th. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a rosary hanging from the rear-view mirror that she looked at once and then looked away from, glanced at her in the mirror as she got in. The dress just visible at the hem below the green coat, the undone hair from where one pin had come loose during the walk. The general aspect of a woman who had just come from somewhere formal and was now in a cab on 9th Street at 8:26 in the morning. He didn't ask. "Where to?" he said. She gave him the address of her studio. The independent firm she'd been running for 16 months, the 3-room space on Dunning Street where she kept a second laptop and all of her project files and where the security system required her biometric key because she was, as she had established earlier, a woman who thought about what happened when things came undone. "Getting in or getting out?" the driver said. She looked at him in the mirror. "Wedding," he said, nodding at the dress. "Getting in or getting out?" "Getting out," she said. He nodded and said nothing else. And she looked out the window at the wet city going past, and she pressed her thumb against the hard edge of the USB drive through the fabric of her pocket, and she thought about the Alderton Bridge project, and the accounts that didn't trace, and a man named Harlan Voss who was known for being incorruptible. She thought about the video, about how specific it was, how deliberate, how it had been designed not just to humiliate her but to preempt her, to close a door before she could walk through it. You did not build a 47-second video that would be distributed to 340 people's phones simultaneously in the final minutes before a wedding ceremony unless you were afraid of something. You did not stage that level of coordinated destruction out of cruelty alone. Cruelty was personal. This was operational, which meant the money was real. The accounts were real. And whatever was on the Alderton Bridge project files was real enough that Grant Holloway and Marcus Webb and a woman named Lena Ford had decided that Sienna Hart's credibility needed to be destroyed before she could use it. The cab stopped at a light on Carver. In the window of a coffee shop on the corner, she could see a television mounted high on the wall, tuned to a local news channel. She couldn't read the chyron from this distance, but she could see the footage they were running, and even at this distance and this resolution, she could see that it was Alderton Cathedral, the main entrance, guests beginning to file out. They were already reporting it. Of course they were. Lena Ford managed narrative control for a living. The press would have been tipped before the ceremony was scheduled to start. The story was already in motion. She pulled her phone out and turned it over. 47 missed calls now, 3 texts from Priya, 2 from numbers she didn't recognize, 1 from a number she recognized and had not been expecting. Her former supervisor at Corman Associates, David Rains, a man she had not spoken to in 14 months. The text from Rains said, "Call me when you're somewhere safe, and be careful." She looked at it for a long time. The light changed. The cab moved. When they pulled up in front of the building on Dunning Street, she paid cash. She had brought cash. She had brought cash because she was the kind of woman who thought about what happened when things came undone. And she went in through the side entrance with her biometric key and took the stairs to the second floor and let herself into the studio and sat down at the secondary laptop and held the USB drive in both hands and breathed. The studio was quiet. Morning light came through the north-facing windows the way it always came, clean and indirect, falling across the drafting table and the wall of project photographs and the small corkboard where she pinned reference images and material samples and structural diagrams. It was familiar and ordinary and entirely removed from what had happened in the last 45 minutes, and she let herself have 30 seconds of it, just the light and the quiet and the familiar smell of the space, before she pushed the drive into the port. The files opened. There were 23 of them, organized, labeled, dated. Someone, and she had a feeling it was not Kelsey, whose handprint was not on this kind of document architecture, had been thorough. Had been the kind of thorough that came from having thought very carefully about evidence and what to do with it. She opened the memo first, the one Kelsey had described. It was exactly as Kelsey had said. 4 months old, 3 pages, written in the flat, bloodless language of internal risk management. Subject, S. Hart. Exposure, risk, and mitigation strategy. She read it once quickly, and then read it again slowly, and the second time she felt the cold return, the specific cold of understanding something clearly. They had known 4 months ago that she had the documentation. They had known because she had, at some point in the preceding months, said something to Grant about the project. She couldn't remember exactly what. Some professional conversation, something offhand, the kind of thing you said to your partner without thinking because you trusted them. And Grant had understood what it meant and had relayed it to Marcus Webb, and they had built the rest of the calendar around it. 4 months of construction. 4 months of keeping her close, keeping her believing in the wedding, in the future, in the version of things they needed her to believe in until the moment it was no longer useful. She opened the second file. Financial records, account numbers, transfer dates, amounts. She was not an accountant, but she was meticulous, and she could read a table, and what she read in the tables made her jaw tighten until she could feel it in her back teeth. The numbers were large. The transfers ran through 3 entities she didn't recognize, and then landed in 2 she did. A holding company that she knew from project documentation to be affiliated with Holloway Group, and an account registered to a nonprofit chaired by Harlan Voss. She sat back in the chair. Outside the window, the city moved through its morning. Somewhere across town, 340 people who had come to watch her get married were dispersing into taxis and onto sidewalks and back to their lives, carrying a story with them that had been carefully designed and placed in their hands. She pulled up her contacts and found the text from David Rains and called him. He answered before the first ring had finished. "Where are you?" he said. "My studio." "Good. Don't go home. They'll expect home." A pause. "Sienna, are you all right?" "No," she said, and the word was honest in a way that surprised her. "Tell me what you know." "I know that someone leaked documentation from the Alderton Bridge project to a federal regulatory contact 3 months ago, not directly, anonymously, through a legal intermediary. The contact has been sitting on it because they didn't have enough to move without exposing the source. But there's been movement in the last 2 weeks that suggests it's getting harder to hold." Another pause. "The people behind that project have been very active in the last month. Unusually active." "Active how?" "Acquiring things," Rains said. "Buying silence, making problems go away." A beat. "The fact that they used you the way they did this morning tells me they're scared. They are not behaving like people who believe they're safe." Sienna looked at the screen in front of her. 23 files, transfer records, a memo with her name in the subject line, a drive that a 23-year-old woman had taken from an open drawer because her name was on the label and she hadn't known what else to do. "How long do I have before they realize the drive is gone?" she said. "I don't know, but Sienna—" Rain stopped, started again. "Be careful about who you bring into this. They have reach, more than you probably know." She thought about the 2 men Kelsey had described, standing near the service exits in clothes that were not formal. She thought about Marcus Webb's voice on the phone. "I'm not supposed to be the one telling you this," and the particular guilt in it, which was not the guilt of someone who felt bad about what was happening, but the guilt of someone who had agreed to the role they'd been assigned and was now being made to look at the cost of it. She thought about Grant, who had let 11 months pass, who had let the dress be made and the invitations be sent and the flowers be ordered, who had sat across from her at dinner and talked about the honeymoon they were planning and looked her in the face and known what was coming. She pressed the feeling down. Hard. Put it somewhere that was not here, not now. "I have the drive," she said. "I have 23 files and at least 2 sets of financial records that trace directly to Holloway Group and to Harlan Voss. I need a forensic accountant, and I need a lawyer who doesn't have any existing relationship with Holloway or Corman." "I have both," Rains said. "Can you trust them?" A brief silence. "Yes." "Then get them on the phone. She looked at the files again. And David, the video. It's a fake. I need someone who can prove it's a fake, technically, in a way that holds up. That I can also do? Then let's move fast, she said, because they're going to realize the drive is gone, and when they do, they're going to move to clean up the other ends. Witnesses, documentation, anything that's still exposed. Agreed. Another pause. Sienna, what are you going to do? She thought about the answer. Outside the north-facing windows, the city was fully awake now, running at its ordinary daytime speed, and in it somewhere were Grant Holloway and Marcus Webb and a woman named Lena Ford, who believed they had done what they set out to do, who believed they had taken a woman who knew too much and made her into a woman nobody would believe. She thought about what they had used to do it, not a direct attack, not a confrontation, not anything that could be answered directly. They had used her love. They had used her trust, her plans, her dress, her ceremony, her public moment. They had weaponized all of it with precise and premeditated efficiency. She thought about what that required, and she thought about what it revealed, because you did not build a machine that elaborate unless the thing you were protecting was worth exactly that much effort to protect. And the thing they were protecting was not Grant's reputation. It was not Marcus Webb's business interests. It was not even Harlan Voss's record of incorruptibility. It was something larger, something that 23 files on a drive only partially described. She needed to know the rest of it. I'm going to find out how deep it goes, she said. And then I'm going to make sure it goes public in a way that they can't contain. A long pause. They won't make it easy, Rain said. I know. People are going to follow you. They may already be watching the building. I know that too. She reached forward and removed the drive from the port. She held it in her fist for a moment, small, light, insufficient feeling for what it apparently contained. Rains was saying something else, something about a contact name and a secure channel, and she was listening, writing things down, but part of her attention was somewhere else. On the last file she'd opened before calling him. The one with the most recent date, 3 days ago, which was not a financial record and not a memo, which was a communication, an internal one, between two parties whose names she now knew. It had been brief, 6 lines. She had read it and then read it again and then set it aside to process later because there had been other files and she had been working quickly. But the 6 lines had not left her. What they described was not historical. It was operational. It was a plan that was currently in progress. Not the wedding, not the video. Those were already done. Something else. Something that was going to happen in the next 2 weeks. And one of the lines, the 4th line, in a voice she recognized now as Marcus Webb's, clipped and transactional, named someone she had not yet mentioned to Rains. A name she recognized. A name that changed the size of what she was looking at considerably. She had not said it aloud yet. She was not ready to say it aloud. But she was going to find out what it meant. Outside, somewhere below, a car slowed on Dunning Street and did not accelerate again, and she moved to the window's edge without standing in front of it and looked down at the street below. And the car was dark-colored and parked now, and the engine was still running, and she could not see the occupant clearly from this angle, but she could see well enough to know that whoever was behind the wheel was not moving. They had found her faster than she'd expected. She stepped back from the window, her heart rate climbing but controlled, and thought about exits. She knew this building. She had chosen it partly because she knew it, had reviewed the floor plans, knew the secondary stairwell at the back that ran to the loading dock, knew that the loading dock opened onto the alley behind the building, and that the alley connected to Marsh Street 200 feet west. She reached under the drafting table and retrieved the spare bag she kept there, always packed with the basics, because she was a woman who thought about load-bearing walls and double-threaded buttons and what happened when structures came undone. I have to go, she said into the phone. Sienna, send me the contact information. I'll reach out in 2 hours from a different number. She paused. David, don't tell anyone you've spoken to me. Not yet. She hung up. She put the drive in the bag. She put the bag over her shoulder, over the green coat, over the ivory dress that had taken 11 months to make. She went to the back stairwell and she went down. And below her, in the car on Dunning Street with the engine still running, someone was already making a phone call, and the phone call was going through, and on the other end of it, a voice was giving an instruction. Not loud, not urgent, but very precise. The instruction was, don't let her leave the block. She went down 2 flights on the balls of her feet, heels in her left hand, bag against her side, and did not make noise. The back stairwell was concrete and unfinished, the kind of utilitarian space that existed in every building and that nobody thought about until they needed it. A single fluorescent tube on each landing. The smell of dust and cold pipe and the faint chemical residue of cleaning product applied long ago and not since repeated. She counted the steps without meaning to. It was automatic, the way certain professional habits became physical. And at the bottom landing, she stopped with her hand on the push bar of the fire door and listened. Nothing on the other side that she could identify as human. The low, constant ambient noise of a building's mechanical systems. The distant sound of the city. She pushed through. The loading dock was a concrete platform at the level of a delivery truck's bed, and it was empty at this hour, the receiving bay closed and padlocked, a handcart lying on its side near the far wall. The alley beyond the dock was narrow and slightly damp, the pavement still dark from the previous night's rain. She stepped off the platform onto the alley floor and moved west without pausing. At the mouth of the alley, she stopped and looked around the corner onto Marsh Street. Traffic, pedestrians, ordinary city morning. Nothing that read as surveillance, but she knew that didn't mean much because good surveillance didn't read as anything. She had been inside the building for less than 20 minutes. If the man in the car on Dunning Street had called ahead, they would need time to reposition. She had maybe 90 seconds. She walked out onto Marsh Street and turned north and did not run. Running was visible. Running created a narrative. She walked at the pace of someone with a destination and a reason for it. And she kept her face angled slightly down, and she made it 2 blocks before she turned east, and then 1 more block before she found the entrance to the Marsh Street Transit Station and went underground. The platform was mid-morning sparse. A few commuters, a woman with a stroller, a man in work clothes with a coffee balanced on his knee. She stood near the far end where the light from the tunnel hadn't quite reached, and she breathed, and her heart was running fast, and she let it run. Didn't try to manage it, just let the physical fact of it do what it needed to do. The train came in 3 minutes. She rode it 4 stops east to the Caldwell interchange, changed lines, rode 2 stops south, and got off at a station she had never used professionally, had no documented reason to be near, and emerged onto a street she knew only from maps. There was a pharmacy on the corner. She went in and bought a prepaid phone with cash and a bottle of water and a granola bar she didn't want, and she stood at the back of the store near the blood pressure monitors and activated the phone and called the number Rains had texted her. It rang twice. "Vera Moss," said the voice on the other end. Low, precise. The voice of someone who answered phones this way because every call was potentially the beginning of something consequential. "David Rains gave me your name," Sienna said. A brief pause. "When did you speak to him?" 40 minutes ago. "Where are you?" "Somewhere south of Caldwell. I'd rather not specify." "That's fine." Another pause, shorter. "He told me some of it. I need to hear the rest from you. Not because I don't trust David, because I need your words. Details matter, and secondhand details degrade." Sienna found a section of wall between a display rack and a locked pharmacy cabinet and put her back against it and told Vera Moss what she knew. She was precise and sequential, and she did not editorialize. She described the drive, the files, the memo, the financial transfers, the name Harlan Voss, the communication dated 3 days ago, and the car on Dunning Street. She described Kelsey Marsh and the timeline of the morning and the video. She described Marcus Webb's voice on the phone and what it had communicated beyond its words. Vera Moss listened without interrupting. When Sienna stopped, there was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds. "The communication from 3 days ago," Moss said, "the one with the 4th line. What did it say?" Sienna had memorized it on the first reading the way she memorized structural specifications, not deliberately but inevitably, because her mind organized what mattered and held it. It referenced an accelerated timeline for something described as the secondary containment phase, and it named someone as the point of contact for that phase. She paused. The name was Commissioner Aldrich Thane. The silence this time was 7 seconds. "Say that again," Moss said. She said it again. "All right." Moss's voice had not changed in pitch or tempo, but something behind it had shifted. A recalibration, a new assessment of weight. I need you to get to a specific address. I'm going to give it to you once and not repeat it. Are you ready? Yes. Moss gave her an address on the east side, a street Sienna didn't know. She recorded it in her head the same way she'd recorded the memo. How long? Sienna asked. 20 minutes by transit if you move now. Don't take a cab. Not traceable by plate, but the payment creates a record if they're already running your cards. A pause. Are you all right? I'm functional, Sienna said. That's not what I asked. I know. She looked at the granola bar in her hand, which she still hadn't opened. I'll be at the address in 20 minutes. She ended the call. She bought a transit card with the remaining cash she had in the emergency fold of her wallet. $240, which she now understood she'd packed there months ago as if some part of her had known, which was not a useful line of thought, and she abandoned it. And she went back underground. On the train, she opened the granola bar and ate it without tasting it and looked at her reflection in the dark window across the car. The green coat over the ivory dress. The hair that had been carefully arranged this morning and was now less so. The face that was her face, that had appeared on 340 people's phones in a context designed to make it mean something it didn't mean. She thought about what Aldrich Thane's name meant. Thane was the city's infrastructure commissioner, had been for 6 years. He oversaw exactly the kind of municipal development projects that the Alderton Bridge project had been classified under, which meant he had been in the approval chain, which meant the financial transfers to Harlan Voss's nonprofit were only one layer of a structure that went at least one layer higher. Voss was a committee member. Thane was the committee's oversight. If Thane was what the communication 3 days ago suggested he was, this was not a case of a couple of people in private industry running money through a public official. This was the city. She got off at the Eastfield station and followed the address north on foot for 7 minutes. The building she arrived at was unremarkable. 4 stories, commercial ground floor currently vacant. The upper floors residential or office use, hard to tell from the street. A buzzer panel by the door with labeled units. She found the one Moss had described and pressed it. Come up, said the intercom immediately, which told her Moss had been watching the street. The office on the 3rd floor was a single room with 2 windows that looked out over the street, a conference table that had been used hard, 3 chairs, and a wall of filing cabinets that were closed and locked. A laptop was open on the table. Beside it, a woman in her mid-50s was standing, not seated, standing, the way people stand when they've been operating at a level of intensity that makes sitting feel wrong. Vera Moss was shorter than her voice had suggested, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that were the particular shade of dark brown that looked black in low light. She was wearing a jacket that had been good once and was still professionally adequate. She looked at Sienna, took in the coat, the dress, the general condition of a woman who had left a catastrophic public event through a service corridor 2 hours ago, and her expression registered it without dwelling on it. Sit, she said. Tell me about the 4th file, the financial transfers. Walk me through what you saw, sequentially. Sienna sat. She walked her through it. Moss typed without looking at the keyboard, her eyes on Sienna's face the whole time, and asked precise, blunt questions when she needed clarification. Dates, amounts, the specific account identifiers Sienna had seen, the structure of the entities named. It took 11 minutes. When they finished, Moss turned the laptop slightly so Sienna could see the screen. I'm going to show you something, she said, and I want your reaction without context first. Just tell me what you see. The screen showed a document, legal formatting, dense text, the kind of thing that took training to read quickly. Sienna looked at it, and her eyes moved down the page and stopped at a paragraph in the 2nd third of the document, and she read it, and then she looked up. That's the Alderton Bridge Project's funding authorization, she said. Or part of it. The part that was never filed publicly, Moss said. The part that exists only in the municipal records room, which is not publicly accessible, and in the private records of the entities who signed off on it. She pulled the laptop back. I've had this for 8 months. I've been waiting for enough corroboration to move. Where did it come from? Moss looked at her for a moment. From someone who is no longer in a position to come forward. The person who submitted the anonymous regulatory tip that David Rains mentioned. A pause. They died 6 months ago. Officially a cardiac event. He was 52 and had no history of cardiac problems. The room was very quiet. How much are we talking about? Sienna said. Across all the accounts and entities we've been able to identify, somewhere between 40 and 60 million, possibly more. The transfers run through enough layers that the full number requires a forensic accountant and access to records we don't currently have. I might have more records, Sienna said, on the drive. I know. That's partly why you're here. Moss reached across the table and set down a business card, blank except for a phone number. I have a forensic accountant who can look at those files today. In this building, no one moves the drive off-site until we understand what we have. Sienna looked at the card and then at Moss. Who are you? She said. Rain said you were a lawyer. I am. That's not all you are. Moss's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something drier than that. I've been building a case against the people involved in this project for 14 months. I have a client who was financially damaged by the fraudulent approval process and has a legitimate civil claim. But civil claims in cases like this go nowhere unless there's criminal exposure that forces cooperation. The regulatory tip was supposed to be that lever. When the source died, we lost it. She looked at Sienna steadily. You walked through that service entrance this morning carrying something I've been trying to reconstruct for over a year. Sienna absorbed that. You knew about me, she said, before this morning. I knew you'd worked on the project. I knew you'd flagged the funding anomalies internally and been told they were cleared. I didn't know you had documentation. A pause. I didn't know they were planning what they did this morning. But you're not surprised by it. No, Moss said quietly. I'm not. The intercom buzzer sounded from downstairs. Both of them looked at the panel on the wall. One buzz, then a pause, then two in quick succession. A pattern, clearly. Moss's face did not change, but she moved to the window in a way that was too practiced to be casual and looked down at the street. My accountant, she said, and the tension in her shoulders released by a single degree. He's cautious. He always announces a pattern. She buzzed him in. His name was Perry, and he was younger than Sienna had expected. Early 30s, round-faced, with the slightly unfocused look of someone who spent most of his waking hours looking at numbers on screens. He carried a laptop bag and a tablet, and he nodded at Sienna with the brief professional acknowledgement of someone who had been briefed on the way up and was already thinking about the problem. Sienna gave him the drive. He sat at the far end of the table and went to work immediately, not speaking, and the room reorganized itself around his presence in the way rooms do when someone is doing something specific and consequential. Moss poured 2 cups of coffee from a maker on the filing cabinet and set one in front of Sienna. It was black and strong, and Sienna drank half of it in 3 swallows. The communication from 3 days ago, Moss said, sitting across from her. The secondary containment phase. What does your read tell you that means? That the video and the wedding were phase 1, Sienna said. Destroying my credibility publicly before I could use whatever they believed I had. Phase 2 is something else, something operational. Thane's name being attached to it. Suggests they're not waiting to see if phase 1 holds, Moss said. They're moving in parallel. Destroying evidence, Sienna said, or witnesses. The word sat between them. Sienna thought about the man who had submitted the anonymous regulatory tip. 52 years old. No history of cardiac problems. She thought about Kelsey Marsh, who was back at Alderton Cathedral right now, or had gone home, or was somewhere in this city carrying the knowledge that she had taken a drive from a drawer and given it to a woman in an ivory dress in a stone corridor. Kelsey, she said. Who? She told Moss about Kelsey. Told her quickly and completely. And she watched Moss's face as she did, and she could see the same calculation running behind Moss's eyes that was running behind her own. Moss was already picking up her phone before Sienna finished the sentence. I'm sending someone to her, she said. Where does she live? I don't know her address. She works at... She stopped. She couldn't name Corman Associates without potentially alerting someone. I have her cell number. Call her, right now. Tell her to get out of wherever she is and go somewhere public, somewhere with cameras, and stay there until she hears from you. Moss was already typing with her other hand. Don't tell her more than that. Just move her. Sienna picked up the prepaid phone and dialed Kelsey's number. It rang and rang and rang. Voicemail. She kept her voice level. Kelsey, it's Sienna. Don't go home. Go somewhere with a lot of people and stay there and call me back on this number. She paused. Do it now, please. She hung up. She looked at Moss. She's not answering. She might have her phone off. She might be on the train. Give it 10 minutes. Moss's voice was even, but her eyes were not. Perry, she said across the room. Working, he said without looking up. How long for a preliminary read? On 23 files? He tilted his head. Depends on what format they're in and how layered the account structures are. Give me an hour for the broad strokes. 45 minutes, Moss said. I'll try. Sienna got up from her chair and stood at the window, slightly back from the glass, looking down at the street below. The city moved in its ordinary way. A delivery man with a dolly, 2 women with shopping bags, a man walking a dog that was pulling hard against the leash, nose to the ground, following something invisible. She had been engaged to Grant Holloway for 14 months. She had known him for 2.5 years before that. She had been inside his apartment and his family home and his professional life and his private habits. The way he ordered the same thing at restaurants so he didn't have to think about it. The way he slept with one arm outside the covers. The way he lost his patience with technical problems and became methodical about emotional ones. She had believed, with a clarity she had not thought to question, that she knew him. She understood now that she had known a character Grant had played with considerable consistency and commitment. And she understood that the discipline required to play that character for 3.5 years without breaking was a different thing than what she would have called his personality. It was a different kind of person, a fundamentally different architecture. It made her feel, when she let herself feel it, like the floor had been replaced with an image of the floor, like she had been walking on something painted to look solid. She pressed her thumb against the windowsill until the feeling passed. Her new phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered it. Sienna Hart, said a voice she did not know. Male, mid-register, measured, not threatening in its tone, which somehow made it more threatening. She said nothing. Ms. Hart, I'm going to assume you're somewhere you think is safe, and I want you to understand that's fine. You being somewhere safe is not a problem for us. A pause. What would be a problem, for you, specifically, is continuing on the path you're currently on without understanding what you're actually dealing with. Who is this? She said. Someone who's calling as a courtesy. That's genuinely what this is. I want you to understand that. You've had an extraordinarily difficult morning and you're operating under a lot of emotion, and I think if you were thinking more clearly, you'd recognize that the smartest thing you can do right now is take a step back. A step back, she repeated. The documentation you have and yes, we know you have it, is incomplete. You know it's incomplete because you're a smart woman, and you can see what the files contain and what they don't contain, and what they don't contain is the context that would make them mean what you think they mean. The voice was very smooth, practiced. The voice of a man who had delivered difficult messages many times and had refined the delivery. Taking incomplete information to people who will misinterpret it is not justice. It's noise. And noise has a way of causing collateral damage to people who haven't done anything to deserve it. Moss was watching her from across the room. Sienna put the phone on speaker and set it on the windowsill without announcing she'd done it. People like Kelsey Marsh, Sienna said. A brief pause. Kelsey Marsh is a young woman who made a poor decision this morning based on incomplete information. Nobody wants to harm Kelsey Marsh. She's irrelevant. The word irrelevant landed wrong. Slightly too fast, slightly too flat. Then why isn't she answering her phone? Sienna said. I have no idea why your bridesmaid isn't answering her phone. The voice maintained its register with effort that was now, she thought, slightly visible. I'm not calling about Kelsey Marsh. I'm calling about you. What about me? You're an architect, the man said. You understand that structures require a foundation. You understand that when you remove a load-bearing element incorrectly, things fall on people. Not just the people you intended, everyone in the building. A pause. Some of the people involved in the Alderton project are not people who have done anything wrong. Some of them are people who signed documents they were told were routine and didn't look closely enough. If this goes the way you're apparently planning to take it, those people get destroyed along with the people who actually... He stopped, recalibrated. The point is that it's complicated. Complicated, she said. Yes. You had a video made of my face, she said. You distributed it to 340 people at my wedding. You had my fiancé disappear the morning I was supposed to marry him. You had me followed from my own office building within 2 hours of the ceremony. She paused. And you're calling to tell me things are complicated. The silence that followed was the first genuine silence from him. Not a calculated pause, but an actual one, a moment where the script had run out. Walk away from this, he said finally, and the smoothness in his voice had degraded by a half measure, just enough. What I'm telling you is that the cost of not walking away is higher than you currently understand. Tell Lena Ford, Sienna said, that the video was sloppy. The ambient room noise doesn't match the visual environment. I noticed it on first watch. A forensic analyst will have a report in 48 hours. She picked up the phone. Don't call this number again. She ended the call. The room was very quiet. Perry had stopped typing. Moss was looking at her with an expression that was professional and very nearly calm, except around the eyes. Lena Ford, Moss said, media consultant. She built the video. I know who she is. Moss stood up. She doesn't take work like this for private clients. She's done work for Thane's office before. Twice, at least, that I'm aware of. She crossed to her own phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds, of which Sienna heard only Moss's half. When she hung up, she said, My contact at the regulatory office is going to have this flagged as an active intimidation event before end of day. That gives us a degree of... Her own phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something moved across her face, quick, controlled, suppressed before it could become legible. She answered it. Yes, she said, and then, when? And then, where? She hung up. She looked at Sienna, and in the half second before she arranged her face into the appropriate expression for delivering bad news, Sienna already knew. Kelsey Marsh, Sienna said. She was taken by ambulance from the Alderton Cathedral parking structure 30 minutes ago. Moss's voice was very even. She collapsed near her car. They're saying it looks like a panic attack. She's at County General. She's alive. She's conscious. They're assessing her. It wasn't a panic attack, Sienna said. No, Moss said. Probably not. Sienna stood very still for a moment. The window behind her was letting in the flat gray light of a November morning, and it fell across the conference table and across Perry's hands, which had gone still on the keyboard, and across the coffee cup in front of the empty chair where she'd been sitting. She thought about Kelsey's face in the stone corridor, the fine tremor, the bouquet vibrating in her grip. I found it by accident. I didn't go looking. A 23-year-old woman who had done the right thing because she hadn't known what else to do. I need to get to her, Sienna said. You can't go to County General, Moss said. If they know she's the source of the drive, they'll be watching the hospital. You walking in would confirm the connection and put both of you in a worse position. Sienna looked at her. I'm not saying don't help her, Moss said. I'm saying we do it correctly. I have someone at that hospital within the hour. She won't be alone. She held Sienna's gaze. You staying functional and out of reach is the best thing you can do for Kelsey Marsh right now. You understand that. The part of her that wanted to argue with it recognized that the argument was emotional and the logic was sound, and she hated that. And she said nothing. Perry, Moss said. I need 30 more minutes, he said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a quality of focus that had gone several degrees more intense in the time since she'd put the call on speaker. But I can tell you right now that what I'm seeing in these files is not 40 to 60 million. He looked up from the laptop, briefly, and his face had the expression of a man who has picked up what he believed was a small rock and discovered it is connected to the ground. It's significantly larger than that, and it doesn't stop at Thane. The room absorbed that. How much larger? Moss said quietly. Perry looked back at the screen. Let me have the 30 minutes, he said. Outside, a siren went past on the street below. An ambulance, heading east, its sound curving away and then gone. Sienna watched it go and then turned back to the room and the table and the laptop and the man working through the files she had been carrying in her pocket 2 hours ago when she walked out of her wedding through a service door in an ivory dress. She sat back down. She was done running. She was done waiting to understand what she was dealing with before deciding to deal with it. The man on the phone had told her the cost of not walking away was higher than she currently understood, and maybe that was true, but the calculation he was running assumed that the thing she most wanted to protect was her own safety. He had miscalculated. What she most wanted to protect now was not her safety. It was not her reputation, which they had already tried to dismantle. It was not even justice in the abstract, clean, and theoretical. It was the specific reality of a 23-year-old woman who had been put in a hospital for doing the right thing. That was not something she was going to walk away from. Perry looked up from the screen. "Sienna," he said, and he said her name with the careful precision of someone who is about to change the size of the room. "You need to look at this." She leaned forward, and what she saw on the screen made everything she had understood until this moment, the memo, the video, the transfers, the names, contract into something small and preliminary, a first chapter in a document whose full length she was only now beginning to measure. The screen showed a name. Not Thane, not Voss, not Marcus Webb, or Lena Ford, or anyone whose name she had spoken aloud in the past 3 hours. The name on the screen was David Rains. Sienna looked at it for long enough that Perry shifted in his chair, the way people shift when they are watching someone absorb something and are not sure what form the absorption is going to take. She looked at the account number beside the name. She looked at the transfer date, 16 months ago, which was 2 months before she had left Corman Associates, which was the same month she had flagged the funding anomalies internally and been told they were cleared. She looked at the amount. She looked at the amount for a long time. "Perry," she said. "I know." "That's David Rains." "I know who it is." She sat back in the chair and her hands were flat on the table, and she was aware of them. The physical fact of her own hands, the slight roughness of the table surface under her palms. Because the rest of her was not entirely present. Some part of her had gone somewhere else for a moment, to a place that was very quiet and very cold, and was doing something wordless and necessary. Moss had come around the table and was standing behind Perry, looking at the screen. Her face was doing what Sienna suspected her own face was doing, holding very still over something that was moving fast beneath the surface. "When did he call you?" Moss said. "This morning. He texted first. The text said to call him when I was somewhere safe." "And you called him?" "Yes." "You told him you had the drive?" "Yes." She heard her own voice, flat, diagnostic. "I told him I had 23 files. I told him about the financial records. I told him about Voss and Thane." She stopped. "I gave him Thane's name." The room was very quiet. "He already knew it," Moss said, and she said it carefully, not as absolution but as fact. "He already knew everything on that drive, or close enough. That's not the problem." "The problem is he knows where I am," Sienna said. "I told him I was south of Caldwell. I told him I was going to call back in 2 hours from a different number." Moss moved to the window before Sienna finished the sentence, stepping back from the glass, looking down at the street with the practiced lateral gaze of someone doing a fast threat assessment. Her hand was already on her own phone. "Perry, shut the laptop and pack it," she said. "Everything off the table, 2 minutes." Perry didn't argue. He was already closing windows on the screen and ejecting the drive. "Wait," Sienna said. They both looked at her. "Think about it," she said. "If Rains is in the transfer records, if he took money from the same accounts that Holloway Group was running the fraud through, then he's not just a co-conspirator. He's compromised. He's been compromised for at least 16 months. She looked at Moss, which means when the anonymous regulatory tip was submitted, the one from the source who died, Rains would have known about it, Moss said. He would have known about it because he was positioned to know about it. He was senior enough at Corman to be in the loop on anything touching Alderton. And if the source was someone inside Corman, the source was someone inside Corman, Moss said. Her voice had gone very quiet. His name was Paul Drexler. He was a project coordinator. He'd been at the firm for 11 years. Sienna had not known Paul Drexler. She had started at Corman 4 months before she left, and the firm was large enough that you did not know everyone. But she could construct the shape of what had happened to him from what she already knew, and the shape of it was simple and horrible. Rains found out he'd submitted the tip, she said. Moss didn't answer. She didn't need to. Perry had the laptop in its bag and was standing by the table with the drive in his hand, and he was looking at Sienna with the expression of someone who is waiting for the next instruction and hoping it comes fast. "We need to move," Moss said. "Now, not in 2 minutes." "Where?" Sienna said, standing. "I have a secondary location. I don't use it for client meetings. Nothing on record connects it to me professionally. It's clean." She was already moving toward the door. "But we can't go directly. We separate. We take different routes. We arrive within 10 minutes of each other. If they're watching the building, one person leaving draws less than 3. "And if they're already inside the building," Sienna said. Moss paused at the door. "Half a beat. Then we find that out in the lobby." They went down separately, Moss first, then Perry 2 minutes later, then Sienna. She descended the stairwell alone, and the stairwell was different from the one at the Dunning Street studio. Carpeted, interior lit, the kind of building where the common areas had been maintained better than the offices. And she went floor by floor and listened at each landing and heard nothing that was not a building's ordinary internal noise. The lobby was empty except for a man at the building's single desk, who did not look up. She went through the glass door and onto the street and turned north and walked. She made it 4 blocks before she understood that something was wrong. It was not a specific thing. It was an accumulation. A car that had been parked at the corner of the first block was now at the corner of the third, which was not impossible but was unlikely. A man on the opposite sidewalk who was walking at the same pace she was walking without the forward lean of someone with a destination. The particular quality of attention that trained itself on you and that you could feel on the back of your neck if you had learned in the past 6 hours to pay the right kind of attention. She did not change her pace. She did not look back. She turned east at the next intersection, then north again, then east again, a series of turns that had no logical destination, and the car did not follow. But the man on the sidewalk did. He was better than the car. He changed his pace when she changed hers, dropped back when she paused to look in a shop window, picked up when she moved again. She would not have noticed him if she had not been specifically looking for exactly this. She went into a coffee shop on the corner of Haverford and 9th and went directly to the back and through the kitchen, a fast walk, confident, the kind that said she belonged there, which she absolutely did not. And a prep cook said something sharp and she said back exit in a voice that did not leave room for discussion, and he pointed at a door and she went through it. Another alley. The city seemed to be made today entirely of alleys. She came out on the far side and moved fast, 3 blocks, before slowing to a normal pace and pulling out the prepaid phone and calling the number Moss had given her as the secondary location's contact. Moss answered in one ring. "I had a tail," Sienna said. "I know. I lost mine in the transit station. Where are you?" She read the intersection from the street signs above her. 12-minute walk from the secondary, Moss said. "Go straight east on whatever street you're on until you hit Fenwick, then north 4 blocks. There's a laundromat on the ground floor of the building. Go through it and up the back stairs." She went. The laundromat was warm and smelled of heated fabric and detergent, and 4 people were inside doing ordinary Saturday things with their laundry, and none of them looked at her. The back stairs were concrete, which seemed to be the city's load-bearing architectural preference today. She went up 3 flights and knocked at the door marked with a piece of masking tape that had a hand-drawn X on it, because Moss was a lawyer who had been doing this long enough to know that the simplest signals were the hardest to overlook. Moss opened it. The secondary location was a studio apartment that smelled like it was used for storage and occasionally lived in. A cot in one corner, a folding table, 2 chairs, a window that looked at a brick wall. It had the quality of a space that had been designed for exactly this kind of moment and used for nothing else. Perry was already there, the laptop open on the folding table, the drive back in the port. 30 more minutes and I'll have the full number, he said, without looking up. You said that 40 minutes ago, Moss said. The structure is more complex than I thought. He looked up briefly. It's not 40 to 60 million, and it's not 100 million. It's larger than that. And it runs through entities in 4 states. Nobody said anything. Sienna sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off the heels entirely. She'd been carrying them since the loading dock, running on the balls of her feet, and set them on the floor and looked at them. 11 months for the dress. The shoes had been found in 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon in a showroom on Madison, and she had felt a particular quiet satisfaction in finding them quickly, in not being the kind of woman who agonized over shoes. She was very tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, the kind that came from running a continuous internal calculation against an environment that kept changing the variables. "Tell me about Rains," she said. "What you know, not what the files show. What you actually know about him." Moss sat in one of the folding chairs. She was quiet for a moment, and Sienna could see her making a decision about how much to say and deciding to say it straight. David Rains has been senior partner at Corman Associates for 9 years. Before that, he was municipal project director under the previous infrastructure administration, which overlapped with Harlan Voss's early years on the committee and with Aldrich Thane's tenure as deputy commissioner. She folded her hands on her knee. "He has a financial relationship with a holding company that I've been aware of for about 6 months, but couldn't place until today. The transfer in Perry's files places it definitively." A pause. "He introduced you to Grant Holloway." The quiet that followed had a specific weight. Sienna remembered it. A professional dinner, 18 months into her time at Corman, one of the kind that senior partners hosted for staff they wanted to retain, expensive restaurant, a few outside guests, the comfortable performance of institutional generosity. Grant had been one of the outside guests. Rains had made the introduction himself, standing next to her, his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Sienna Hart, one of our best—" "Grant Holloway, you probably know his family's work." She had thought it was incidental, the way these things happened at these dinners. "He introduced me to Grant," she said. "Yes." "That wasn't incidental." "No," Moss said. "I don't think it was." She looked at the brick wall through the window. She looked at it for a long time. She was thinking about the specific shape of what had been done to her. Not just the wedding, not just the video, but the full architecture of it, starting from the professional dinner 18 months ago, or further back, from whenever Rains had identified her as someone who would eventually look too closely at the Alderton documentation and see what was there. They had built Grant around her, or built her around Grant. The direction didn't matter. What mattered was that her entire relationship, the 2.5 years of it, the 14 months of engagement, the 11-month dress, had been a containment structure. She had been inside a cage built to look exactly like a life. She should feel something enormous about that. She was aware that she should. The enormousness of it was there, present and enormous. But she was also very tired and her feet ached, and there was a 23-year-old woman in a hospital 2 miles from here because Sienna Hart had not been sufficiently careful with the information she had, and the enormousness was going to have to wait. "The charity gala," she said. Moss looked at her. "Grant is planning to announce a new engagement at the Alderton Foundation's charity gala. I saw it in the communication files. There was a reference to an event, a major media presence, a public platform." She met Moss's eyes. "When is the Alderton Foundation gala?" Moss went still. "Sienna, when?" 3 days from now," Moss said. "Friday evening, the Prestige Hotel downtown. It's nationally televised. The foundation does a live broadcast every year. It's a major fundraising event." She paused. "Grant Holloway is one of the featured speakers, and Thane will be there. Thane chairs the foundation's advisory board. He's always there. And Rains." A beat. "Rains has attended every year for the past 7 years." Sienna looked at her hands on her knees, the French manicure she'd had done 2 days ago for the wedding, which now seemed to belong to a different version of her life, which it did. She looked at the dress, which was still what she was wearing, which was increasingly absurd, which she did not have the bandwidth to address until this conversation was finished. "I want to be there," she said. "Absolutely not," Moss said, and she said it the way she said things. Not with heat, but with finality. A wall, not a suggestion. "Listen to what I'm saying." "I heard what you're saying. You want to walk into a televised event 3 days after a viral public scandal with the evidence we've been compiling and, yes, and expose it in a setting where they can't contain it. Moss stood up. Sienna, they have people. You had a tail within 4 hours of leaving that building this morning. If you walk into that gala, you are putting yourself in a room with the 3 or 4 people who have already demonstrated that they are willing to. She stopped. Started again. Paul Drexler was 52 years old. I know. You know abstractly. You didn't know Paul Drexler. No, but I know Kelsey Marsh. Her voice stayed level. And I know what the man on the phone this morning sounded like when he said her name. She looked at Moss directly. They're not going to stop. You know that. Whatever secondary containment means, whatever they're planning with Thane in the next 2 weeks, it's not going to stop because we file documents with a regulatory board that has been sitting on a tip for 8 months. They have reach inside that board. You said it yourself, and that's why the tip hasn't moved. Moss was quiet. They need a public moment, Sienna said. Something that can't be buried. Something that is already on camera, already witnessed, already too large to be quietly managed before morning. She paused. That gala is that moment. It's already going to be televised. All I have to do is change what it's televised for. You make it sound very clean, Moss said. It won't be clean. No, it won't. Moss looked at her for a long time. And if they move against you inside that room before you can get to a platform, then they do it on camera, Sienna said, in front of a live audience and a national broadcast. The folding chair scraped against the floor as Moss sat back down. She pressed 2 fingers against her lips and looked at the middle distance and was doing what Sienna was also doing, which was running the calculation. The variables. The structural load. 3 days is not enough time to build what we'd need, Moss said finally. What do we need? The financial documentation, fully traced and formatted for presentation, not a preliminary analysis, a complete evidentiary record. The video debunked by a technical analyst on record. Witness statements. She paused. And something that puts Thane directly in the chain, not just as a name in a communication. A direct financial link or a documented instruction. Perry said the structure goes further than we thought. Perry hasn't finished. Then he finishes tonight, Sienna said. And I need a technical analyst for the video. Does Raines know about the analyst you were going to refer me to this morning? Moss's eyes sharpened. No. That referral doesn't go through David. It never has. Then we use them. And for witnesses, she stopped. Because the witness she was thinking about was in County General, and the witness before that was dead. And the witness she hadn't yet considered was standing in a cathedral parking lot this morning in a bridesmaid's dress. And she didn't know yet how much Kelsey had seen or what she would be willing to say on record. But Kelsey was alive. That was the start of something. Her phone buzzed. The prepaid phone, not her regular one. Unknown number. Different unknown number than the morning call. She answered it. Silence on the other end for 2 seconds. And then, Sienna. She knew the voice, Grant. She had not heard his voice since, she calculated, 4 days ago, when they had spoken briefly about the seating chart for the reception. He had been at his desk, slightly distracted, half his attention on something else. She had thought he was distracted by work. She had thought a great many things. His voice now was different, not the managed, half-present voice of a man at his desk. This was stripped of something, or several things, and what was left was rawer than she had heard from him in 3.5 years, and she was aware, in a way she found unpleasant, that it sounded more real than he had ever sounded before. Don't hang up, he said. Give me a reason. A breath. Because I need to tell you something, and I need to say it before Marcus knows I'm saying it. I don't have a lot of time. She looked at Moss, who had heard the voice through the speaker and was already recording on her own device pointed at the phone. Talk, Sienna said. The drive, Grant said. The files on the drive. There are 23 of them. I know how many there are. There's a 24th, he said. It's not on the drive. It was never put on the drive because Marcus pulled it before the drive was compiled. He pulled it because it has his name on it in a way that the others don't. It's a direct instruction, written, signed, dated. from Marcus to Lena Ford, specifying what the video needed to show and what needed to happen at the gala if the drive surfaced before the secondary phase was complete. Her hand tightened on the phone. "What does it say needs to happen at the gala?" she said. A pause, longer than the others, and in that pause she could hear something, not traffic, not city noise, but the specific interior silence of someone who is standing very still somewhere enclosed. Somewhere he did not want to be heard. It says that if evidence surfaces publicly before the gala, the secondary phase activates immediately instead of on the 2-week timeline. His voice had dropped half a register. And the secondary phase isn't just evidence destruction, Sienna. It's not just witnesses, it's Marcus has a contact in the federal prosecutor's office. He has documentation fabricated, I'm telling you, none of it is real, that positions you as the architect of the fraud, not us. You. The woman who flagged the funding anomalies internally gets reframed as the person who designed the cover for them. She felt the cold again, the specific structural cold of understanding something clearly. "He's going to frame me," she said. "If you go public with what you have before he's ready, yes. He has a federal contact ready to receive the fabricated file within 24 hours of a trigger event." Grant's breath came unevenly. "I didn't know about this part. I knew about the video. I knew about the wedding. I didn't know about Drexler, and I didn't know about the federal piece, and I didn't know about Kelsey this morning until Marcus called me and told me it was handled, and He stopped. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not calling for that. I'm calling because if you go public with what you have before you have the 24th file, he buries you, federally, with a prosecutor who owes him and a file that's been building for 6 months and will look very convincing." Sienna stared at the brick wall through the window. "Where's the 24th file?" she said. "Marcus's office. Physical copy in his desk safe. Digital copy on a private server that I know the access credentials for because I set up the server originally and he never changed them when we had the falling out 18 months ago." A pause. "He doesn't know I have the credentials. He thinks I'm still where he needs me to be." Another pause. "I'm not." "Why?" she said. A long silence. "Because whatever I did, and I did it, I didn't sign up for a dead man," Grant said. "Paul Drexler didn't know what he was walking into. He was a project coordinator who found something wrong and reported it the way you're supposed to, and," his voice cracked once, clean and brief. "I can get you the server credentials, right now on this call. But if I do that, Marcus knows within the hour that I've turned, and whatever protection I currently have disappears." Sienna looked at Moss, who was listening with her eyes closed and her expression doing something complicated and precise. "Give me the credentials," Sienna said. "Sienna! Grant!" Her voice was not loud. "Give me the credentials." He gave them to her. She memorized them the way she memorized everything that mattered. Then she said, "Where are you right now?" "Hotel. I haven't been to the apartment since this morning. I figured—" "Which hotel?" he told her. "Don't leave it," she said. Don't call Marcus. Don't call anyone. Stay in the room." She paused. "And Grant?" "Yeah. If any part of what you just told me is another layer," she said, "I will make sure that the last thing that happens before every person in this conspiracy is prosecuted is that your specific role in all of it is the most publicly and completely documented of anyone's. Do you understand me?" A long silence. "I understand," he said. She ended the call. The room had the particular quality of a space in which something irrevocable had just been said. Perry had stopped typing again. Moss had opened her eyes. "The federal fabrication file," Moss said. "Can they do it?" Sienna said. "Realistically, a fabricated file, a compromised federal contact, does that hold up?" With enough time to build the surrounding record, and the right prosecutor and a target whose credibility has already been publicly demolished, Moss looked at her steadily. "Yes, it holds up long enough to ruin you. Even if it eventually unravels, the process takes years, and the damage is immediate." Sienna stood up from the cot. She picked up the heels and held them by their straps and looked at them and set them back down. She was not putting them back on. She was done with the heels. "Then we have less than 3 days," she said. "We need that server. We need the 24th file. We need Perry's full analysis, the video debunking, and whatever we can establish about Kelsey before the gala. She looked at Moss. And we need a way into that gala that they don't see coming. Moss looked back at her. You're different than you were 4 hours ago, Moss said. It was not a criticism. Yes, Sienna said. Is that good or bad? Sienna looked at the brick wall one more time, at the flat November light coming around the edges of it, at the dress she was still wearing, which was ivory and silk and had taken 11 months to make, and which was never going to be used for the purpose it had been built for. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me after Friday. She picked up the prepaid phone and looked at the server credentials she had written in her own shorthand in the margin of a receipt from the pharmacy, and she thought about Marcus Webb's private server and a 24th file and a federal prosecutor who owed a favor in a fabricated case that had been building for 6 months against a woman who had flagged an irregularity and trusted the wrong people and worn a dress for 11 months for a wedding that had been a closing argument all along. She thought about what it meant to change the terms of the argument entirely. And then she thought about the gala. The Prestige Hotel, Friday evening, nationally televised, 300 guests, and a live broadcast and a stage that had been prepared for Grant Holloway's speech. And she thought about what those screens were going to show instead, if she could get to them in time, and a feeling moved through her that was not quite rage and not quite clarity, but something that lived at the precise intersection of both. The server credentials worked. Perry had them verified and inside the private server within 19 minutes of the call ending, and the 24th file was exactly where Grant had said it would be, sitting in a folder labeled with a date 6 months prior, unencrypted, as if Marcus Webb had been so confident in the server's obscurity that he hadn't bothered with the additional layer. That confidence was the kind that came from believing you had accounted for every variable. It was the kind that got people destroyed. Perry opened the file and read the first page, and then looked up at Moss with an expression that needed no translation. Moss read it standing over his shoulder. When she finished, she straightened up, and her face was very still, and she said, "Print everything, every page, 2 copies." "Printers at the Dunning office," Perry said. "Not that printer. There's one in the building super's unit on the ground floor. I have an arrangement." She was already moving. "Perry, make a complete encrypted backup of everything on the server before you close the connection. Everything. Not just the 24th file, everything in every folder. Whatever Marcus Webb was confident enough to store on a server he thought was private." Perry was already typing. "How long do I have?" "Until I get back with the printer." She looked at Sienna. 20 minutes. She left. The room recalibrated around her absence. Smaller, more pressurized, the two of them and the laptop and the sound of Perry working, which was fast and focused and had the quality of someone who understood that the clock was not a metaphor. Sienna stood at the window with her back to the room and thought about 3 days compressed into a single operational problem. The gala was Friday. It was currently Tuesday afternoon. 72 hours, approximately, to build what they needed to walk into a televised event and make it impossible to contain. She thought about the screens. The Alderton Foundation Gala used the Prestige Hotel's main ballroom, which she had been inside twice at professional events. She knew the room, knew its proportions, knew the large projection screens on either side of the stage that were used for the Foundation's annual impact presentation. She knew that the AV setup ran through a production company that the Foundation contracted annually. She did not know the production company's name, but she knew it could be found, and she knew that AV production crews worked the venue in the final 24 hours before an event of this scale, and she knew that access to the production infrastructure was the thing. If she could get to the screens, not physically, not by walking into the production booth, but through the signal chain, through someone with legitimate access to the system, through someone who could replace what was scheduled to run with what she needed to run. She turned from the window. "Perry," she said, "working. When you've got everything backed up, do you know anyone in event production? A V broadcast, that level?" He didn't look up. "My brother-in-law runs a production crew. They do corporate events. Does he work the Prestige Hotel?" A pause in the typing. Perry looked up at her. "He's done work there before. I don't know if he's on the Alderton Gala contract. Can you find out? I can call him." "Not yet. When Moss gets back, she looked at the laptop. And when you have the full financial analysis, the complete picture, all of it, everything Perry the accountant would put in front of a federal judge, how long does that take to format into something a layman can follow on a projected screen? He looked at her for a moment. You're not just going to show them documents. No. You want a presentation. I want something that tells the story in the 4 minutes it takes for the people in that room to understand they're watching something they can't unsee before anyone has time to cut the feed. She held his gaze. How long? Perry looked at the ceiling. He was doing a real calculation, not a polite one. If I have everything formatted and clean by tomorrow midnight, and I can, if the backup finishes the way I think it will, then 6 hours for layout, maybe 8 for something that moves well on screen. You have until Thursday noon. Then I need to not sleep Thursday night. I know, she said. I'm sorry. He shook his head once, briefly, and went back to the keyboard. Moss came back with a portable printer under her arm and a look that said she had encountered something minor in the corridor and dealt with it, and Sienna decided not to ask what. They printed 2 complete copies of everything, the 24th file, Perry's analysis, the transfer records, the memo with Sienna's name in the subject line, the communication from 3 days prior. Moss organized 1 copy into a sequence that a lawyer would organize evidence. Sienna organized the second copy into a sequence that told a story. They were up until 2 in the morning. At 2:15, Sienna slept for 4 hours on the cot, while Moss sat in the folding chair with the documents, and Perry worked through the backup and the analysis at the table, the laptop's light the only light in the room, and outside the city did what cities did at this hour, which was keep going anyway. She woke at 6:14 and her neck ached from the cot's inadequate pillow, and there was a paper coffee cup on the floor beside her that hadn't been there when she fell asleep, and it was still warm. She drank it standing up and looked at what Perry had on screen and said, "That's good." "It's not done," he said. "What's done is good. Keep going." Moss came in from wherever she'd been, a brief absence, she didn't say where, and set a bag on the table that contained clothing Sienna's approximate size. Practical clothing, dark-colored, nothing ivory. "My contact at County General," Moss said. "Kelsey Marsh was discharged this morning. She had elevated potassium levels consistent with—" My contact's word was stress-induced, possibly assisted stress-induced, but unprovable. She met Sienna's eyes. "She's at a friend's apartment. My person is with her." "Is she willing to make a statement?" "She's frightened," Moss said. "But she called me this morning, not me personally. She called the number you left her on the voicemail. She said she wants to talk." Sienna changed clothes in the bathroom. When she came out, Moss was on the phone with someone she addressed only as Callahan, and from the half of the conversation Sienna could hear, Callahan was the technical analyst for the video, and Callahan had finished a preliminary review, and what Callahan had found was sufficient for a formal report and would be submitted in writing by end of business Wednesday. One piece at a time. They met Kelsey at noon on Wednesday in a diner 3 neighborhoods from where she was staying, because the diner was Kelsey's suggestion, and Kelsey's comfort was the operational priority. Kelsey arrived with Moss's contact, a quiet, large-framed woman named Sorrel, who had said almost nothing in the 40 hours Sienna had been aware of her existence, and who communicated primarily through the specific quality of her alertness. And she sat down across from Sienna and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. She looked worse than she had in the stone corridor, thinner around the eyes, the way people looked when they had been frightened for long enough that it had become their resting state. She was wearing her own clothes now, not the bridesmaid's dress, and she was holding a glass of water with both hands. "They put something in my water bottle," Kelsey said. "At the parking structure. Someone put something in my water bottle while I was in the cathedral, and I drank it on the way to my car, and then—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I know what a panic attack feels like. That wasn't a panic attack." "I know," Sienna said. "Are they going to do it again?" Sienna looked at her steadily. "Not if you help me make sure they don't have time to." Kelsey looked at the glass of water. Then she set it down and moved it slightly away from her, a small and precise gesture of refusal, and looked back up. "What do you need?" she said. She gave them a written statement that afternoon, in the presence of Sorrel and a notary Moss had arranged, covering everything. The open drawer, the drive, the label with Sienna's name, the contents she had seen, the morning of the wedding, the stone corridor. What she had told Sienna and what Sienna had done. She was specific and sequential, and her voice shook on 2 sentences and held on the rest. When she finished, she signed it and dated it and looked at Sienna across the table. "The man in the suit," she said. "The one I saw at the service exit that morning. I can describe him." "Write it down," Sienna said. She wrote it down. That was Wednesday afternoon. Wednesday night, Sienna called Grant. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been holding the phone. "The credentials held," she said. "I know. I figured you would have used them by now." "We have everything. Perry has everything." She paused. "I need one more thing from you." A long silence. "What?" "Friday night, the gala. You're on the program." "I was," he said. "I don't know if they'll keep me on after this week." "They'll keep you on," she said, "because pulling you means explaining why, and they're not ready to explain anything publicly. You're still useful to them as a facade." She paused. "I need you on that stage Friday night, and I need you to do exactly what they're expecting you to do, right up until the moment you don't." The silence this time was the longest of any she'd had with him in 3 days. "You're asking me to be there," he said. "Yes, when it happens. Yes. Sienna." His voice was rough on her name. "I know what I did. I know what... I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you that I know." "I heard you," she said. "Are you going to be there?" A breath. "Yeah," he said. "I'll be there." She ended the call and sat in the dark of the studio apartment with the documents spread across the folding table and Perry asleep with his head on his arms at the end of it. Finally, after 31 hours of continuous work, and she thought about Friday. Thursday passed in the specific way that days pass when every hour is a discrete task and there is no room between them. The video analysis came back from Callahan. Formal, thorough, 16 pages identifying 14 specific technical inconsistencies in the footage. Perry finished the presentation at 11:40 Thursday morning, and they reviewed it together around the folding table, all 3 of them, and it was the most efficient and devastating document Sienna had ever seen assembled, which she said, and Perry looked at the table and said he'd had good material. Perry's brother-in-law was not on the Alderton Gala's production contract, but he knew the crew chief who was. And the crew chief, when Perry's brother-in-law made a phone call Thursday evening and a certain amount of information changed hands. Not money, information, the specific kind of information that made a person understand the full picture of what their employer's event was being used for, said that he would need to see the documentation. He saw the documentation. He called back 40 minutes later and said that the projection system at the Prestige Hotel's main ballroom ran through a central media server that he had administrative access to as the contracted crew chief, and that the media server could accept new content up to 2 hours before the event's start, and that if someone wanted to schedule a content package to run at a specific timestamp, he could arrange for that scheduling to happen in a way that bypassed the Foundation's own content manager. He said he was doing it for Paul Drexler, whose name he had apparently known, and whose death he had apparently not believed, and he said it once and did not say it again. Friday arrived the way Fridays arrive when you have not slept enough. Not gradually, but suddenly, the dawn appearing as an accusation. Sienna dressed in the dark. The clothing Moss had sourced was still dark-colored and practical, but Moss had also sourced something else. A single garment bag that she brought to the studio Thursday night and hung on the back of the door without explanation. Sienna opened it Friday morning and found a dress. Not ivory, deep charcoal gray, fitted, professional, the kind of thing you wore when you needed to look like you had every right to be exactly where you were. She put it on. It fit. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, which was small and slightly water-spotted, and she did not look like the woman who had stood in front of the larger mirror in the yellow room on Tuesday morning. She looked like someone who had been taken apart and put back together with a different understanding of the load-bearing elements. Moss came in while she was looking and looked with her for a moment. "Ready?" Moss said. It was not a question. "No," Sienna said. "Let's go." The plan had 4 components, and all 4 needed to hold simultaneously, and any one of them failing meant the others were exposed. Sienna had built structures with more complex load requirements, and she did not find this comforting. Component 1 was Perry, who was already positioned at a laptop in a rented workspace 2 blocks from the Prestige Hotel, connected remotely to the backup server that held the full evidentiary package, with a direct line to the crew chief and a timestamp set for 9:47 p.m. 18 minutes into the gala's scheduled programming, 4 minutes after Grant's scheduled speaking slot, at the precise moment the ballroom's ambient attention would be concentrated on the stage. Component 2 was Sorrell, who had spent Thursday identifying the 2 men Marcus Webb had positioned in the building. She had made them within 40 minutes of arrival, which she reported with the brief satisfaction of someone whose professional skills had been validated, and who would be at the ballroom's secondary entrance with a contact from the City Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who had been briefed by Moss on Wednesday and had spent Thursday obtaining an emergency warrant. Component 3 was Moss herself, who would be at the event as a guest. She had a standing invitation as a foundation donor, which Marcus Webb did not know because Moss had spent 14 months ensuring that her connection to this investigation was invisible, carrying the physical documentation package and positioned near the stage left access point. Component 4 was Sienna. She arrived at the Prestige Hotel at 8:15 p.m. through the service entrance, accompanied by no one, carrying nothing except the small bag with the prepaid phone and the original USB drive and the folded copy of the 24th file that she had carried in her pocket since Wednesday because she needed to know it was real. The service entrance led to a corridor that ran behind the kitchen and past the AV equipment staging area, and she moved through it with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going, which she did, because she had spent 3 hours Thursday afternoon memorizing the hotel's floor plan from publicly available renovation permits. The crew chief was a compact, gray-haired man named Rourke, who met her at the staging area entrance and said nothing, only looked at her for a moment and then led her through the back corridor to a position behind the stage-left curtain where she could see the ballroom without being seen. She looked through the gap. The room was full. 300 guests in formal dress, tables with centerpieces, the stage set with a podium, and the 2 large screens flanking it, currently running the Foundation's branded holding content, looping images of infrastructure projects and community programs, the visual language of institutional legitimacy. At the front table, she could see the back of Marcus Webb's head. To his left, Aldrich Thane in a charcoal suit, speaking to the woman beside him. Harlan Voss, 3 tables over. And at the speaker's table to the left of the stage, Grant Holloway, sitting with his hands flat on the tablecloth in front of him, looking at nothing. He looked like a man sitting at the end of something and knowing it. David Rains was at a table near the back. He was the only person in the room, she thought, who looked entirely normal, relaxed, sociable, leaning toward the man beside him with a story or a comment, glass in hand. The ease of someone who had already calculated the odds and found them favorable. She watched him for a moment. She felt something that she did not have time to examine, and so she pressed it down, the way she had been pressing things down for 3 days, into the space she had designated for later, for after, for the version of herself that would have time to sit with all of it. Her phone vibrated. Perry. Package loaded. Timestamp set. System confirmed. 8:41 p.m. 66 minutes. The program began at 8:45 with the Foundation's executive director, a woman named Calloway, who had been running the Foundation for 12 years and who had, as best they could determine, no knowledge of what the Alderton Bridge funding had actually been used for. Calloway spoke for 11 minutes about the Foundation's impact metrics and the upcoming project pipeline and the importance of public-private partnership, and her voice carried genuine conviction, and Sienna found that she could not look at her. At 9:04, Thane spoke. 4 minutes, polished, the cadence of a man who had given versions of this speech many times. He thanked the Foundation's donors. He spoke about infrastructure as the language of civic commitment. He said the word transparency once, with a slight pause before it, and Sienna watched the room respond to it with the warm, affirming attention of people who believed the word meant what it was supposed to mean. She breathed. At 9:12, the executive director returned to the podium to introduce Grant. Sienna moved. Not onto the stage, but not yet. She moved from behind the stage-left curtain to the position behind the AV production desk at the side of the room where Rourke had cleared a space, and she put her hand on the desk's surface and looked at Perry's timestamp on her phone and watched the room. Grant walked to the podium. He looked the same as he always looked at public events. Contained, professional, the particular composure of a man who had been performing composure long enough that it had become structural. He set his notes on the podium and he looked out at the room, and his eyes moved across the audience in the way speakers' eyes moved, landing briefly on faces, projecting connection. His eyes found Marcus Webb. Webb nodded, a small, affirmative gesture. Proceed as planned. Grant looked back at the room. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady. "I'd planned to be here tonight to talk about a project that I've been calling the next chapter for Holloway Group and for this city's development future." He paused. "I'm not going to do that." The room shifted. An almost inaudible recalibration. Not alarm, not yet, just the collective attention sharpening by a degree. "What I'm going to do instead," Grant said, "is ask you to watch something." Marcus Webb's head came up. Grant looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at the clock on her phone. 9:16. 31 minutes ahead of Perry's timestamp. They had discussed this contingency. If the presentation moment came early, if Grant created the opening before the scheduled timestamp, Rourke had manual override. She looked at Rourke and nodded once. Rourke reached across the desk. The screens on either side of the stage went dark for exactly 2 seconds. And then they lit up with the first page of Perry's presentation, which was not a title slide and not an introduction, but a number, a single figure, 9 digits, in a clean sans serif font against a white background. And below it, in smaller text, the words, "Amount transferred from public infrastructure funds through Holloway Group accounts, 2021 to 2024. The room went absolutely still. The second slide came up automatically, timed the way Perry had built it. Account numbers, transfer dates, the first layer of entities. The third slide named Harlan Voss. The fourth slide named Aldrich Thane. The fifth slide was the memo. Subject, S. Hart, Exposure Risk and Mitigation Strategy. The sixth slide was a still image from the fake video alongside Callahan's technical analysis, with 14 numbered annotations marking the fabricated elements. The seventh slide was the 24th file. Marcus Webb's name at the top, his signature at the bottom. The instruction to Lena Ford dated 6 months prior, the reference to a federal prosecutor, the description of a fabricated case to be activated against Sienna Hart upon a trigger event. The room broke. Not all at once, in sections, like a structure failing progressively. The sound began at the back and moved forward, the particular noise of large numbers of people processing something they cannot immediately organize into a framework. At the front table, she could see Marcus Webb on his feet, his mouth moving, his face doing something she had not seen it do in the 2 occasions she had met him, losing its shape entirely, the composure coming apart underneath the pressure of what was on the screens. Thane had not moved. He was sitting with his hands on the table and his eyes on the screen, and his face was the face of a man who was doing a very fast and very private calculation. Voss had pushed his chair back from the table. He was standing now, looking toward the exit, and he had taken approximately 2 steps when Sorrell came through the secondary entrance with the police contact and 2 uniformed officers, and the expression of someone who had been waiting very patiently for exactly this moment. Sienna walked out from behind the AV desk. She walked through the ballroom at the pace she walked everywhere, not running, not performing, the pace of a woman with a destination and a reason for it. And the room was loud now, the controlled chaos of a formal event in the process of becoming something else entirely. And people moved around her and stared at her, and some of them recognized her, and she could see it happen in their faces, the recognition and the recalculation. And she kept walking. She walked to the stage. She walked up the 3 steps to the stage. Grant was still at the podium, and he saw her coming, and he stepped back from it without a word, and she stepped up to it and looked out at the room. At 300 faces, at the screens still cycling through Perry's presentation, at the cameras that were still running because the broadcast feed had not been cut and would not be cut in time, at Marcus Webb, who was moving toward the stage now with a look that had gone past anger into something more primitive and more dangerous. He got 6 feet from the stage before 2 people she had not arranged stepped in front of him. Guests, strangers, Two men in tuxedos who had read what was on the screens and made a decision about it, the kind of organic, unrehearsed decision that happened when 300 people witnessed the same thing simultaneously, and some percentage of them chose the same response. Sienna put her hands on the podium. "My name is Sienna Hart," she said, and the microphone carried it clearly to every corner of the room and to every speaker in the broadcast chain. 4 days ago, I was supposed to get married in this city. What happened instead is on those screens. What you're seeing is not complete. The full documentation has been submitted to the Federal Regulatory Board and the city's Financial Crimes Unit within the past 48 hours, and the individuals responsible are currently being identified to law enforcement. She looked out at the room. "I'm not here to make a speech. I'm here because this room, tonight, is the only place large enough to make sure that what I just said cannot be quietly erased by morning." The room was very loud, and then, in a strange, collective way, it went quiet. She looked at Thane, who had finally turned to look at her. She looked at Voss, who was no longer moving toward the exit because there were now uniformed officers between him and it. She looked at David Rains at the back of the room, who was sitting very still with his glass still in his hand and his expression doing something she had seen once before, the specific expression of a man who has calculated the odds and found them no longer favorable and is sitting with that new information. And then someone at one of the middle tables stood up. She didn't know them, had never seen them, could not have told you their name, and began to clap. It was not the kind of applause that happened at formal events. It was the kind that happened when a room full of people had been holding their breath without knowing it, and suddenly understood they could let it go. And the sound of it filled the ballroom and hit the high ceiling and came back down, and the cameras were still running, and the broadcast feed was still live, and outside the Prestige Hotel, the city was doing what it always did, which was keep going anyway. And Sienna Hart stood at the podium with her hands on its surface and her chin level, and she let the sound happen around her, and she did not move until the officers had reached Marcus Webb's position, and she heard, through the noise of the room, the specific and definitive sound of a man being told he was under arrest and choosing, after a single moment of resistance, not to fight it. It was 9:22 p.m. The screens were still running. Perry's last slide was not a financial record and not a document. It was a single line of text, white on black, which he had added without telling her, and which she saw for the first time now, looking up at it from the stage. It said, "For Paul Drexler." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the podium, and she walked down the 3 steps from the stage, and the room was still in motion around her. Officers, guests, noise, the executive director somewhere behind her saying something into a secondary microphone that the broadcast was probably picking up. And she walked through it all toward the exit on the far side of the room, and her hands were steady, and her chin was level, and she did not look back at the screens until she reached the door. And when she did look back, the slide was still there, white text on black, and the cameras were still on it, and it was going out live to every person watching the feed, and there was nothing anyone in that building could do to stop what had already been seen. Grant was standing near the side wall, away from the stage, away from where the officers were working, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the look of a man who has done the one useful thing available to him, and is now standing with the full weight of everything that precedes it. And she walked past him without stopping, and he did not try to stop her. And that was the right decision, the first right decision she had seen him make, and she noted it and kept walking. Outside, the November air was the same cold it had been on Tuesday morning, the same damp gray cold of the city in this season. And she stopped on the sidewalk in front of the Prestige Hotel and breathed it, and her legs were shaking slightly, which she had not permitted herself to notice inside the building. And she let them shake because there was no one on this sidewalk at this particular moment who needed her to be steady. The broadcast van was parked at the curb, and its satellite equipment was still active, and through the hotel's glass facade, she could see the screen still visible from the lobby. Monitors and the slide was still there. And then it cycled to the beginning and started again because Perry had set it to loop, which she had not known and which was the correct decision. And she stood on the sidewalk and watched it cycle and breathed the cold air and waited for Moss, who would be coming out in approximately 4 minutes with the physical documentation package and a list of next steps that would take weeks and possibly months and would not be simple or clean or finished by morning. She knew all of that. She also knew that what was on those screens was already somewhere it could not be retrieved from. In the broadcast feed, in the phones of 300 people in that ballroom, in the record of a live transmission that had gone out to everyone watching and had kept going out for the full 11 minutes that Perry's presentation ran before anyone in the building had the presence of mind to try to cut the feed, and they had not cut it in time, and it did not matter now whether they cut it at all. Her phone vibrated. Perry. Feed confirmed live for full duration. All slides transmitted. Evidence package confirmed received by regulatory contact 9:18 p.m. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and stood on the sidewalk in the cold November air, and the city ran around her the way it always ran, indifferent and continuous and enormous. And somewhere inside the Prestige Hotel, the last slide was cycling again to the beginning, white text on black, and it said what it said, and it was going to keep saying it until someone made it stop, and nobody was going to make it stop tonight. Moss came out of the hotel at 9:31 p.m. She walked to where Sienna was standing on the sidewalk and stood beside her without speaking for a moment, both of them looking at the broadcast van and the lit facade of the Prestige Hotel and the city moving around the edges of what had just happened. Then Moss said, "Thane's lawyer arrived 6 minutes after the officers did. Webb's lawyer was already in the building. He'd been at the gala." A pause. "Voss didn't call anyone. He sat down when the officers reached him, and he hasn't spoken since." "Voss is the one who talks first," Sienna said. "Yes," Moss said. "That's my read, too." They stood for another moment. "Are you all right?" Moss said. Sienna considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Her legs had stopped shaking. Her hands were steady. The cold air had done something useful for her. Cleared the immediate sensory residue of the ballroom, the noise and the heat, and the accumulated pressure of the past 4 days running at that particular pitch. What was left was not relief and not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those things, something that didn't have a clean name yet. "Ask me in a month," she said. Moss made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged the answer. "I have to go back in," she said. "The Financial Crimes Unit wants a formal statement tonight. While the documentation is fresh and everyone is still in the building, it's going to be several hours." "I know." "You don't have to stay." "I know that too." Sienna turned from the hotel facade and looked down the street, which was ordinary and lit and running at its ordinary speed. "I'm going to walk for a while." Moss looked at her. In the sidewalk's ambient light, her face had the quality of someone who wanted to say something and was deciding whether the moment called for it. "Sienna," she said, "what you did in there, the way you built it, the way you held it together for 4 days without—" She stopped, started differently. "I've been doing this for 14 months, and I didn't get as far as you got in 72 hours. "You didn't have the drive," Sienna said. "No," Moss said, "but I also didn't have what you have, which is a particular kind of mind that looks at a collapsed structure and immediately starts calculating what it would take to rebuild it." She paused. "Don't let that go unused." She went back inside. Sienna walked. She walked without direction for the first several blocks, which was unusual for her. She was a person who moved with destinations. But the city at 9:40 p.m. on a Friday had its own momentum, and she let it carry her for a while. Past restaurants with lit windows and people visible through the glass doing ordinary Friday night things. Past a construction site behind hoarding where she could see the skeletal framework of something large in early stages, just the steel bones of it against the dark sky, unfinished and full of potential and not yet anything in particular. She stopped in front of it. She looked at it for a long time. The way the vertical members connected to the horizontals, the way the load was being distributed across the base. Someone had made decisions about that structure, had drawn it, calculated it, understood that these specific pieces and these specific relationships would hold whatever was placed on top of them. The building did not exist yet. It was only the bones of the decision that it would. She had a thought, standing there, that was not fully formed yet, but that had the feeling of something that was going to become important. She noted it and kept walking. At 10:15, her phone rang. Regular phone, not the prepaid. "Priya." She answered it. "I watched the broadcast," Priya said immediately, and her voice was doing 3 things at once. relief and fury, and something that sounded like it had been held in for several days and was now coming through the only available channel. The whole thing. I watched the whole thing from my couch in real time and She stopped. Sienna, you couldn't have called me? You couldn't have told me you were alive and planning something, and I didn't need to spend 4 days not knowing if... I couldn't tell you, Sienna said. Not because I didn't trust you, because if they'd looked at my contacts... I know why, Priya said, and the fury in her voice sharpened and then, by an act of visible will, receded. I know why. I'm saying it anyway, because I get to. You get to, Sienna agreed. A brief silence, then, Are you okay? I'm walking. Where? I don't know yet. Priya was quiet for a moment. Come here, she said. Tonight. Whenever you finish walking, I have food and I have whiskey and I have the ability to not talk about any of it if that's what you need. Sienna felt something move through her that was warm and specific and real, and she held it for a moment before answering. I'll come, she said. Give me a few hours. She kept walking. At 11:03 p.m., sitting on a bench at the edge of a small park that the city had installed between two commercial buildings. One of those narrow, deliberate urban interventions, a handful of trees and a concrete path and 2 benches, the kind of thing that got approved in infrastructure packages and that most people walked past without registering. Her regular phone rang again. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. Ms. Hart. A man's voice, older, deliberate. My name is Arthur Wynn. I'm a senior investigator with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I apologize for the hour. It's fine, she said. I'll be brief. I've been reviewing the documentation package submitted to our office this week, and I've been watching tonight's broadcast. I'd like to arrange a formal interview at your convenience, earliest possible convenience given the timeline of the active case. A pause. I also want to tell you something that is not standard procedure for me to say to a witness, but which I believe you've earned the right to hear. She waited. The tip submitted 8 months ago from the source we were unable to protect. We've had the documentation he provided under active review since we received it. We were not sitting on it because of corruption in this office. We were sitting on it because we were trying to build a case strong enough that it couldn't be dismantled by the people involved, who have, as you are now aware, significant reach. A pause. The material you submitted Wednesday night, combined with tonight's broadcast, has moved this from a case we were building carefully to a case we are building urgently. There is a difference. I know the difference, she said. I thought you might. Another pause. Paul Drexler's family has been notified that his tip is now part of an active federal proceeding. His daughter, she's 19, asked me to pass along a message if I spoke to you. A very brief silence. She said thank you. Sienna looked at the trees in the small park. They were November bare, just the dark lines of their branches against the lighter dark of the city sky, and they were the same trees they had been an hour ago, and a week ago, and a year ago. Indifferent in the way that growing things were indifferent, continuing on their own schedule regardless of what happened at ground level. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the bench's armrest until she could feel the corner of it clearly. Tell her, Sienna said, and had to stop and start again. Tell her it wasn't enough, but it was something. I will, Wynn said. Good night, Ms. Hart. She sat on the bench for a while after the call ended. The park was empty, except for her. A single light on a post cast a yellow circle on the concrete path, and outside the circle, everything was the ordinary ambient dark of a city that never fully went dark. Somewhere, a few blocks away, a car alarm ran through its sequence and stopped. Somewhere further, a siren. She sat with it all. The noise and the quiet in between the noise, the cold, the specific quality of being alone in a city that was full of people, the accumulated weight of the past 4 days pressing down through her and into the bench and into the ground below it. She did not cry. And then she did briefly and without any particular drama, in the way that things that have been held in long enough finally come through regardless of what you decide about them. Not grief exactly, not relief. something that was composed of both and also of the names she had been carrying. Paul Drexler, Kelsey Marsh, the 19-year-old daughter, Perry asleep on his arms at the folding table, Priya watching the broadcast from her couch, not knowing if Sienna was alive. She sat with it for as long as it took, and when it was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and breathed the cold air and sat for another few minutes in the quiet. Then she got up from the bench and walked to Priya's apartment, which was 22 blocks north, and she walked the whole way. The weeks that followed were not clean. The legal process was exactly what Moss had said it would be when Sienna had asked, standing in the laundromat stairwell on Tuesday afternoon, what it would take to close this properly. It was long and grinding and full of procedural moments that felt like reversal, but were not. Marcus Webb's lawyer filed 3 motions in the first week that were each defeated and replaced by 2 more. Thane resigned from the commissioner's office on the 4th day and issued a statement through his legal team that described his role as administrative and indirect, which was the kind of statement that looks like distance and is actually confession. Voss did exactly what Sienna had predicted. He talked, and he talked early, and what he said in exchange for his cooperation agreement became the 4th supporting document in a federal case that Arthur Wynn's office was now running with the particular focused velocity of a division that had been patient for 8 months and was done being patient. David Raines resigned from Corman Associates on the 6th day. He did not issue a statement. He did not call Sienna. His lawyer contacted Moss's office on the 8th day to discuss cooperation terms, and Moss spent 45 minutes on the phone with that lawyer and reported back to Sienna with a face that communicated volumes in its restraint. The cooperation terms were not generous. Raines had introduced a young architect to a man who was being used as a containment mechanism and had let that architecture run for 3.5 years and had been present in some form for the decisions that had resulted in Paul Drexler being dead. There was a version of the law that was going to acknowledge that, and a version that was going to be lenient about it, and the version that prevailed was going to be determined by a process that Sienna was not in control of and had decided not to spend her energy trying to influence. She made that decision on the 9th day, standing in Moss's actual office, the real one, on the 17th floor of a building downtown, with windows and furniture and the full visible apparatus of a legitimate practice, while Moss walked her through the case timeline. "What do you need from me going forward?" Moss asked at the end of the walkthrough. "Tell me when it's over," Sienna said. "Between now and then, I'm going back to work." Moss looked at her. "That's it?" "That's it. You have everything you need. You have the documentation and the testimony and Wynn's office and Voss's cooperation and the broadcast record." She looked out the windows at the city. "I'm not a lawyer. Staying in this room doesn't make the case better. It just keeps me in this room." She went back to work on the 11th day. The Dunning Street studio had been watched for approximately 36 hours after the gala, according to Sorrell, who had maintained a quiet monitoring presence in the area and reported back to Moss. After that, the surveillance had stopped, which was either because the people running it had more pressing concerns, federal proceedings had a way of redirecting institutional attention, or because someone had made a decision that Sienna Hart was no longer the variable she had been. Either way, she walked back into the studio on the 11th morning and unlocked it with her biometric key and stood in the doorway and looked at the drafting table and the project photographs on the wall and the small cork board with its reference images and material samples. And then she walked in and sat down at the desk and opened the laptop and went through 2 weeks of email. There were 47 professional inquiries. Some of them were curiosity, people who had watched the broadcast and wanted to be adjacent to whatever she was now. She deleted those. Some of them were genuine, clients she'd been in conversation with before Tuesday, projects she'd been developing, relationships that predated all of it. Those she responded to, carefully, one by one, in the plain and specific language she used for professional correspondence. One email was from a development firm she'd never worked with, proposing a project she'd never have taken 6 months ago. Too large, too complex, too much structural innovation required for a firm of her current size. She read it 3 times. She wrote a response that said she was interested and would need 2 weeks to assess feasibility and would they be available for a preliminary conversation at the end of the month. She sent it before she could think too carefully about whether it was the right decision. Grant's legal process was separate from the others, and she followed it only through Moss, who gave her updates at intervals and without editorial comment. Grant had cooperated fully from the night of the gala forward, which his lawyer had already begun leveraging in the expected ways. His family's business interests were in the process of being dismantled through civil proceedings initiated by the city. The Holloway Group name was being removed from 3 active development contracts, and the family foundation had suspended operations pending review. Claudette Holloway had given a single press statement that said the family was cooperating with authorities and had no further comment, and Sienna had read it once and closed the browser tab and not looked for it again. She did not speak to Grant. She did not want to speak to Grant. She was aware that somewhere in the complicated structure of what she felt about 3.5 years of her life, there was going to be a reckoning that was more personal than professional, more internal than legal, and she was aware that she was not ready for it, and that being not ready was a legitimate position to hold for as long as she needed to hold it. Kelsey Marsh called on the 14th day. Sienna was at the Dunning Street studio when the call came, working through the feasibility assessment for the large project, surrounded by preliminary sketches and structural calculations that she'd been running on the back of whatever paper was available. She answered on the second ring. "How are you?" Kelsey said. She asked it the way young people sometimes ask difficult questions, directly, without preamble, because they hadn't yet learned the social conventions for approaching hard things sideways. "Better," Sienna said. "How are you?" "Still weird," Kelsey said. "My hands shake sometimes. The doctor says it'll stop." "It will." "Yeah." A pause. "I got a call from a federal investigator. They want me to testify." "I know, Moss told me." "I'm going to do it." She said it quickly, as if she'd been deciding and had decided and needed to say it before the decision could become uncertain. I wanted to tell you first." Sienna set down the pencil she'd been holding. "Kelsey, you don't owe me anything." "I know I don't. That's not why." A brief silence. "I'm doing it because Paul Drexler did it, and nobody protected him, and at least if I do it, there's someone still here to see it through." She paused again. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Sienna said. "It makes complete sense." "Okay." A breath. "Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Kelsey." Sienna stopped. Started again, more carefully. "What you did in that corridor, taking the drive, coming to find me in the hall, you were terrified. I could see how frightened you were. And you did it anyway." "I didn't know what else to do," Kelsey said, which was exactly what she'd said in the corridor. The same words in the same voice, but different now after everything. The same words meaning something larger than they had. "That's what courage is," Sienna said. "That's exactly what it is." A long pause on the line. "Thank you," Kelsey said quietly. Then, "I should go. I have a meeting." "Go," Sienna said. "Take care of yourself." She set the phone down and sat for a moment with her hands on the desk and the sketches around her and the studio's familiar light coming through the north-facing windows, and then she picked the pencil back up and went back to work. The gala broadcast had been viewed in the weeks following by a number that the media covered with the particular energy they brought to numbers that were larger than expected. The story moved through its news cycle. The initial burst, the follow-up investigations, the think pieces about public corruption and infrastructure fraud, and the specific vulnerability of municipal approval processes to the kind of long-running manipulation that the Alderton Bridge project had involved. Sienna was interviewed twice, once by a print journalist and once by a broadcast news program, and both times she said what was factual and declined what was speculative and directed questions about the legal proceedings to Moss's office. And both times the pieces ran with photographs that she had not chosen and descriptions of her that used words like resilient and brave, which she found less accurate than the words she would have chosen, which were something more like functional and stubborn. She built the firm, not quickly and not easily. She had known from the beginning that building something real took longer than destroying it, and that the post-broadcast attention was not a foundation and would not last, and that what she was building needed to be built on something more durable than a news cycle. She was careful about the projects she accepted. She hired 2 people in the second month, a structural engineer named Bastian, who had been freelancing and was meticulous and difficult to work with in productive ways, and a recent graduate named Nia, who reminded her, in certain specific ways she did not dwell on, of the version of herself that had sat at a studio table in architecture school next to Priya and survived a professor who thought sleep deprivation was educational. Nia asked her once, in the third month, about the Alderton Cathedral project. Not the fraud, the building itself, its structural history, its architectural choices. It was a professional question, a genuine one. Sienna answered it thoroughly and without discomfort, which surprised her until she realized it shouldn't. The building was the building. It had been there before Tuesday morning, and it was there still, and it would be there for a long time after all the proceedings were finished and all the names had been either cleared or convicted. And what had happened inside it on that morning was already becoming something she carried differently, not lighter, but differently distributed. The weight reorganized across a stronger structure. 6 months after the gala, Marcus Webb was convicted on 7 counts. Thane pled guilty to 4 and received a sentence that Moss described, without visible emotion, as proportionate to his cooperation. Voss's cooperation agreement held, and his sentencing was deferred pending the completion of the broader proceedings. David Rain's case was still moving through its process, which was slower and more complex and would take, Moss estimated, another 8 to 12 months. Lena Ford was convicted separately, in a proceeding that included the video fabrication and 2 prior similar cases that the federal investigation had surfaced. Her sentence was the longest of any of them. Sienna read the verdict in the news, sitting at the desk in the Dunning Street studio on a Tuesday afternoon in May, and she sat with it for a moment and then closed the browser and went back to the drawing she'd been working on. There was a morning in early June, the 6th month, when she arrived at a construction site at 7 a.m. for a walkthrough inspection of a project that was in its second phase, a mid-rise residential development on the east side of the city, the one she'd accepted from the firm she'd never worked with before, the one that had been too large and too complex, and that she'd sent the preliminary response to before she could second-guess it. The building was in its framing stage now, the steel skeleton up and the concrete work beginning, and she walked the site with Bastian and the general contractor and pointed at things and asked questions and looked at the structure from different angles, the way you looked at structures to understand how the load was moving through them. At a certain point, Bastian and the contractor moved ahead to look at something on the far side of the floor plate, and she stopped and stood in the middle of the framing and looked up. The sky above the open structure was the particular blue of early summer mornings, clear and absolute, the sun still low enough that its light came in sideways and hit the steel at an angle that made the members glow along their upper edges. The building was not beautiful yet. It was only its skeleton, only the essential decisions that everything else would be built on. But she could see what it was going to be, had been seeing it for months in the drawings, and standing inside the structure of it was different from seeing it on paper in a way that she had always found difficult to explain to people who were not architects. It was the difference between the idea and the proof. She stood there for a moment with the sun on the steel and the city visible through the open frame on all 4 sides, everything around her and below her and going about its business, and she thought about the feeling she'd had standing in front of the construction site the night of the gala, the thought that had not been fully formed then. She understood it now. You could lose every finished thing. They could take the dress and the wedding and the relationship and the reputation and the years of accumulated trust, and it would all be devastating. And the devastation was real, and she was not going to pretend otherwise or narrate it into something instructive. But underneath all of the finished things, underneath what had been built and then dismantled, there was something that was not a finished thing. It was the capacity to build, the ability to look at a set of constraints and materials and requirements and understand what they could become. That was not a thing that could be taken, because it was not a thing. It was a way of seeing. They had tried to take her credibility, her story, her name, her future. They had not thought to try to take that. Bastian called her name from across the floor plate. She looked over and he was pointing at something in the north corner, a connection point he wanted her to see. She walked toward him, stepping over the deck plates, her boots solid on the concrete, and she looked at what he was pointing at and she said what she thought about it. And he said what he thought, and they went back and forth about it for several minutes, which was how they always worked, which was good. She went back to the site 3 more times that week. In July, she moved the firm to a larger space, still on Dunning Street, which she had decided she had no intention of vacating for the satisfaction of the memory, 2 floors up from the original studio and 3 times the square footage. She set up the drafting tables and the project wall and the corkboard, and she pinned the first reference images and material samples for the East Side project, and she stood in the middle of the new space and looked at it and thought that it was, like all the structures she cared about, better understood from the inside than the outside. Priya helped her move in on a Saturday, because Priya had been helping her do difficult things for 15 years and showed no sign of stopping. And at the end of the day, they sat on the floor of the new studio with their backs against the drafting table and drank from a bottle of red wine that Priya had brought and did not talk about any of it, which was exactly what Sienna needed. "What are you going to call it?" Priya said eventually. She meant the firm. "It's already called Heart Studio," Sienna said. "Has been for 16 months. I meant, are you going to keep that? After everything." Sienna looked at the new space, at the clean walls and the project photographs she hadn't hung yet, and the window that looked out over Dunning Street, which was ordinary and lit and running at its ordinary speed. "Yes," she said, "it's my name." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." They sat on the floor a while longer. The city moved outside the window the way it always moved, continuous and indifferent and full of people living their particular versions of things. And the wine was decent, and the floor was hard, and the studio smelled like fresh paint, and the particular dry smell of new space that had not yet been lived in enough to take on a character. It would, Sienna thought, given time and work and enough people moving through it with enough purpose, it would. She leaned her head back against the drafting table and looked at the ceiling and thought about the East Side project and the question Bastian had raised about the North Corner connection and the answer she hadn't quite finished working through. She thought about the new project that had come in on Thursday, smaller, a renovation of an existing structure in the South District, the kind of project that required understanding something built under different constraints and making it work for different requirements. She thought about Nia, who had submitted her first complete design proposal that week, and whose work had in it something that Sienna recognized because she had recognized it in her own early work, the specific ambition of someone who understood that structures were arguments, that every building was a position on what space could do to the people who moved through it. She thought about the East Side building in the early morning light, the steel skeleton against the blue sky, the load moving through the members toward the ground. She was not finished with what had happened to her. She was not going to pretend she was finished with it, or that the finishing happened on a schedule, or that the schedule was something she was interested in announcing. There was work still inside her that was not the professional kind, and she was going to do that work privately and at her own pace, the same way she had done everything else that mattered. But she was also not going to let what had happened to her be the largest thing about her. She had been left at an altar by a man who had used her trust as a structural component in someone else's architecture of fraud. She had been publicly humiliated and privately targeted and had spent 4 days running on 4 hours of sleep and a granola bar she hadn't wanted, and she had come through the far side of it, and she was sitting on the floor of her own studio on a Saturday evening drinking decent wine with her oldest friend and thinking about load distribution in steel-framed residential construction. She was going to keep thinking about it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Outside the window, the city was going about its business in the warm July evening, and the light was the particular gold of summer at this hour, falling across the buildings and the street and the window of the studio where Sienna Hart sat on the floor with her back against a drafting table. And she was not the woman who had stood in a yellow room in an ivory dress, believing in something that had been designed to betray her. And she was not the woman who had run down a loading dock in borrowed heels carrying a USB drive and the beginning of a case she didn't yet know how to finish. She was something that had come after both of those women, made from the same materials but structured differently, the load-bearing elements in better arrangement, the foundation understood in a way that could not be undone. She picked up the wine glass. Priya picked up hers. They did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said, and the city was full of light, and it was enough.